Story number 1. The house on Maple Lane stood quiet under Michigan's gray winter sky, but its silence was a lie. For Daniel and Sarah, it was their fresh start, a cozy home in a friendly neighborhood far from the city's clamor. Yet, from the moment they crossed the threshold, the air felt heavy, like someone else was already there, watching. They laughed it off, blaming their nerves, but the house had plans, and it wasn't about to let them settle in. That first night, as they unpacked boxes, a light flickered in the upstairs hallway. Not a sputter, but a deliberate pulse, like a heartbeat. Sarah glanced at Daniel, her smile uneasy. "Old wiring," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. By morning, the curtains in the living room circled gently, though every window was sealed tight. They joked about drafts, about ghosts playing tricks, but the house seemed to listen, waiting for its moment to answer back. The weeks passed, and the tricks grew bolder. A radio in the kitchen blared static at midnight, then fell silent when they entered. Doors creaked open just an inch, only to stay still when checked. Sarah found her favorite mug on the floor one morning, uncracked but far from its shelf. They clung to logic, faulty circuits, uneven floors, but doubt crept in, a shadow that grew with every unexplained moment. What was this place? And what did it want with them? Then came the night that broke their denial. They were downstairs, curled up with a movie, when a deafening crash shook the house. The first big encounter that we experienced was our bedroom door slamming shut while we were watching a movie downstairs. And it was loud enough to rattle the paintings on the living room wall. They raced upstairs, hearts pounding. When we opened the door, the bedding was off of our bed when it was originally tidy, and the curtain pole had fell off the window. The room felt wrong, the air thick with a presence they couldn't see. Daniel checked the windows, the door frame, anything to explain it. Nothing. The house seemed to hum, a low vibration only they could feel. From then on, the bedroom became the heart of the disturbance. It was never a different room, too, always the main bedroom. The door being slammed during the day and at night, things being in places that we didn't leave them, pillows on the floor, etc. Each slam was a message, each misplaced item a claim on their space. The house wasn't theirs. It never had been. The disturbances grew routine, a grim rhythm to their days. Pillows scattered, books toppled, lamps flickering like mocking eyes. They stopped inviting friends over. How could they explain the chaos? Sarah began to dread sleep, her dreams filled with a faceless figure standing just out of sight. Before I mention this next part, though, I just want to ensure that you know that my wife has never, ever experienced sleep paralysis in her entire life until one night in April, where she woke up and saw a tall figure that resembled a human but wasn't. It stood in the corner, motionless, its shape blurring at the edges. She described it as just standing still, watching in the corner of the room. Sarah's scream woke Daniel. She clung to him, trembling, describing the figure's hollow gaze. They sat up until dawn, a comedy flickering on the TV, but laughter couldn't banish the chill. This freaked her out enough that she woke me up, and we both had to sit and watch a movie until she could feel comfortable enough to fall asleep again. The next night, it was Daniel who woke, certain he'd heard footsteps circling their bed. Nothing was there. But the air pressed against him, heavy with intent. The entity, whatever it was, grew bolder. Paintings dropped off of the walls, pillows thrown across the room again, bottles of deodorant being slammed off of walls. A mirror in the hallway cracked without cause, its jagged lines like a warning. It's to the point where I'm mentally drained of coming home from work and knowing that there's a huge mess to clean up when I get there. Daniel's days at the office became a refuge, but returning home meant facing a battlefield of scattered belongings and unseen rage. They researched the house's history, desperate for answers. Built in the 1960s, it had no record of tragedy, no murders, no deaths. I mean, our house isn't that old. I'd say the 60s or 70s. We live in a nice area. So why would it be haunted? Yet the disturbances felt personal, as if the entity resented their presence. Sarah found old newspaper clippings about the land, nothing conclusive, but whispers of a fire decades ago, a family displaced. Was that the source? They couldn't know. Their lives unraveled under the strain. Sleep came in fits, interrupted by crashes or the sense of being watched. We are so mentally drained at this point, and we can't afford to move. They tried sage, prayers, even a local medium who fled after an hour, pale and silent. I fear that things are only going to get worse from this point, too, and physical. Is this a warning? Is this just getting started? The entity hadn't touched them yet, but each thrown object felt like a threat, a promise of worse to come. Daniel began to notice patterns. The disturbances peaked when they spoke of leaving, as if the entity feared abandonment. One night, as they whispered about selling the house, the bedroom door slammed so hard the frame splintered. A glass on the nightstand shattered, shards glinting in the moonlight. They froze. Realizing the truth, this wasn't just a haunting. Something claimed this house, and it saw them as intruders. Now, they live in a fragile truce, tiptoeing through their own home. The entity watches, always present. Its anger a weight they carry. They've stopped fighting it, too exhausted to resist. But in quiet moments, Daniel wonders, what does it want? To drive them out or to keep them forever? The house on Maple Lane holds its secrets tight, and for Daniel and Sarah, every day is a gamble with an unseen tenant who refuses to leave. Story number 2. In the neon glow of a Louisiana summer night, the air buzzed with the promise of danger. Though 12-year-old Caleb didn't yet know it, he stood at the edge of a pulsing teen nightclub, the kind that had sprung up like weeds in the 1980s, all disco lights and pounding music. The crowd inside moved like a single writhing beast, and Caleb, too small for his age, felt like prey. He'd never wanted to come. Crowds made his skin crawl, but his friend's excitement had dragged him along. Now, as he lingered by the door, a prickle of unease crawled up his neck, as if the night itself was watching. The eyes found him before he found them. A man out of place among the teenagers stood across the room, his gaze locked on Caleb like a hunter sizing up a deer. Short brown hair, a striped collared shirt, and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was wrong, all wrong. Caleb's stomach twisted, his instincts screaming to run. He didn't know the man, but the man seemed to know him. And that was enough to make the boy's heart race. I was about 12 and had a group of friends that I hung out with regularly. I lived in Louisiana. Caleb's world was bike rides, comic books, and the humid embrace of a small southern town. There was this fad back then, too, to open these teen nightclubs. No alcohol, just disco music and flashing lights that promised a taste of grown-up thrills. When a new club opened just outside town, Caleb's friends buzzed with plans. I hate crowds, but I was a follower in my group. So in the end, I agreed to go with everybody. The night was warm, the kind where sweat clung to your skin before you even stepped outside. Caleb's mom dropped the group off, the car's headlights cutting through the dusk. We paid our $2 to get in. I can see that it's super crowded, shoulder to shoulder. The club was a chaos of bodies, the air thick with cheap cologne and the thump of bass. Caleb hovered near the entrance, his sneakers scuffing the sticky floor, debating whether to stay. His friends had already vanished into the crowd, their laughter swallowed by the music. After 10 or 15 minutes pass, I get this feeling like somebody's watching me. It wasn't just the noise or the lights, it was a weight, a pressure that made his skin prickle. He scanned the room, eyes darting over swaying figures. Then I noticed this middle-aged guy, short brown hair, striped collared shirt. He's just staring at me with an intensity that felt personal, almost possessive. Caleb froze. He didn't recognize the man, but the man's gaze held a familiarity that chilled him. Well, I knew that I didn't know him, and that was my cue to leave. Caleb slipped out the door, the night air a relief against his flushed cheeks. The club was miles from home, but he'd walked farther before. It was about a 5-mile walk down a well-lit, semi-busy 2-lane highway, then right, and another couple of miles down a 4-lane road into the subdivision. The highway stretched ahead, lined with gas stations and fast food joints, their signs glowing in the dark. It was early enough, and Caleb figured he'd be fine. He started walking, the rhythm of his steps steadying his nerves. Halfway home, the world grew quieter, the highway giving way to a narrower road flanked by ditches and overgrown grass. Caleb's thoughts wandered until headlights sliced through the darkness behind him. A car slowed, its engine a low growl, and Caleb's pulse quickened. He kept his eyes forward, but the car pulled alongside him, its window rolling down with a faint squeak. And I guess about halfway home, this car pulls up on the side of the road that I was crossing. And it's the same guy from the nightclub. The man leaned out, his face half lit by the dashboard's glow, his smile sharp as a blade. My heart starts pounding out of my chest. Caleb's fear was no longer vague. It was a living thing, clawing at his chest. I mean, he creeped me out when there was like around 200 people around. I was really creeped out on an isolated side street by myself now. The man's voice cut through the night, but he yells at me and asks if I want a ride. Caleb shook his head, his voice barely a whisper, as he said no. His feet already moving faster. Then he yells at me, "You want to make an easy $20? The words hung in the air, a lure dipped in poison. Caleb, naive but not foolish, hesitated for a split second. And I'm dumb. I stop and ask how. The man's grin widened. He says, "Hey, get in the car and I'll tell you." But Caleb's instincts screamed louder than his curiosity. He bolted, his sneakers pounding the pavement, the night blurring around him. I took off, and I don't think I've ever run that fast in my entire life. The road stretched endlessly. Each step a battle against the terror that the man was following. Caleb's lungs burned. His legs screamed, but he didn't stop. I ran the last 3.5 miles full speed without stopping and without looking back. The subdivision's familiar streets finally came into view. The glow of porch lights a beacon. I made it home, ran inside the house, and straight to my room. He collapsed onto his bed, heart still racing, the door locked behind him. I didn't even think to look back, since if he was following me, Caleb's dad was in the living room, the TV's flicker a quiet comfort. But Caleb didn't breathe a word of what happened. I never did tell anybody about what actually happened that night. He lay awake, replaying the man's face, the way his voice had carried a promise of something dark. But when I think back on it, I really think that I was one dumb move away from being on a milk carton, or maybe something worse. In the weeks that followed, Caleb avoided the club, sticking closer to home. He overheard rumors, other kids talking about a strange man hanging around, watching too closely. But no one had a story like his. The town felt smaller after that, its edges sharper. Caleb's friends noticed he was quieter, less eager to follow their plans. But he never explained why. Years later, as an adult, Caleb drove past the old club site. It was gone, replaced by a strip mall, but the memory of that night remained vivid. He wondered who the man was, what he'd wanted, and how close he'd come to disaster. The highway still stretched through town, but Caleb never walked it alone again. Some nights, he'd wake with the echo of that voice in his head, get in the car, and shiver, grateful for the instinct that had saved him. Story number 3. The house was quiet, save for the soft hum of a laptop playing music in the dead of night. But something else was there, lurking just beyond the edges of perception, watching with eyes that didn't blink. It wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense, no chains, no moans, just a presence that clung like damp air. And when it chose to show itself, it didn't scream, it whispered, it knocked, it smiled. For Sarah, that night would mark the moment she stopped doubting the impossible. Almost a decade ago, Sarah was dating a guy named Craig, a man with a charm that made her overlook his strangest claim. Craig said a spirit had followed him since childhood, never harming him, just lingering and showing itself in odd ways. His family believed it. Having seen strange things when Craig was near, Sarah didn't buy it. Thinking it a red flag, why would he share such a bizarre story unprompted? But in her early 20s, she ignored it because Craig seemed so normal otherwise. She eventually decided he genuinely believed it, preferring that to thinking he'd lie to unsettle her. She reasoned his strange experiences had logical explanations. Sarah wasn't one for ghost stories. She prided herself on her skepticism, her ability to find the rational in the chaotic. But Craig's calm certainty gnawed at her, like a puzzle she couldn't solve. One night, Craig stayed over at her place. The first time they'd spent a full night together. They talked, planned their future, kissed, and listened to music. By 2 a.m., something odd happened. They sat on her bedroom floor, backs against the wall opposite the door, browsing music videos on her laptop, when 3 loud, rapid knocks hit the door. It was late, and the only other person in the house was her mom, who'd been asleep for hours and never knocked, especially with guests over. Sarah's heart leapt. The sound was too sharp, too deliberate. She checked if she'd imagined it, but Craig was staring at the door too. The air thickened, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Before Sarah could call out, an angry male voice shouted her name, like a father scolding a child for breaking something precious. Her blood ran cold. It wasn't her mother's voice, and it wasn't human in its fury. It took minutes for them to muster the courage to approach the door. They stayed pressed against the wall, staring at it, glancing at each other, every second stretched, the silence between them screaming louder than the knocks. Sarah pressed her ear to the door, hearing nothing. She grabbed a golf club from her closet before opening it, revealing just a dark hallway. They checked every corner of the house, even closets, and found nothing. But Sarah felt eyes were burning into her, as if someone was watching and judging her every step. The sensation was suffocating, like a weight pressing on her chest. She shrugged it off, since they found no one. In bed later, she admitted feeling creeped out. Craig casually said, "I told you I have spirit that follows me." His matter-of-fact tone unnerved her. It was too calm, too accepting, as if this was just another Tuesday. Sarah lay awake, the darkness outside her window feeling alive, watchful. Weeks passed, and Sarah tried to forget that night. She rationalized it. Maybe she was tired, maybe the house creaked, maybe her mind played tricks. But the memory lingered, a splinter in her thoughts. Craig slept over again, and they were in the kitchen past midnight when he got a call from his sister. He stepped into the backyard to take it. The backyard linked to the kitchen via a sliding glass door. So Sarah could see him if she stayed in the kitchen, and he remained by the door. A large window above the kitchen sink looked out to the side of the house. Sarah washed dishes while he talked, glancing between the window and Craig at the glass door. The mundane task felt like a tether to normalcy, but the night had other plans. She focused on a stubborn dish, then looked up at the window and stepped back. Craig stood outside it, grinning at her. Not a normal smile, but a wide, toothy grin, eyes unnaturally wide. It was like something wearing his face, mocking her with its stillness. Sarah laughed, thinking it a joke, and gestured for him to stop and come inside. But he didn't move. His eyes locked on hers, his grin unwavering, not even blinking. The longer he stared, the more wrong it felt, like a mask stretched over something not human. After 10 seconds, she grew uneasy, still assuming he was pranking her. Her pulse raced. No one could hold a stare like that without blinking. Then the sliding glass door opened to her right. She looked away and saw Craig entering from the backyard. When she looked back at the window, the grinning Craig was gone. Her knees buckled. It was impossible. She told Craig what she saw, and he said, "I believe you. It's happened before." He took her hand and led her to the bedroom, and she felt eyes burning into her back until the door closed. Even in bed, she sensed something standing outside the door, waiting. They broke up soon after for unrelated reasons. Nothing strange has happened since, and a decade later, Sarah hasn't felt watched or seen anything odd. Sarah's skepticism held, but those nights cracked it. She moved on, built a life free of shadows, but the memories returned each autumn, unbidden. Craig's spirit wasn't a ghost in a white sheet. It was something older, subtler, tied to him like a shadow no light could dispel. What was it, a guardian, a parasite, or something that fed on doubt? Sarah dug into Craig's past years later, contacting his cousin through social media. The cousin confirmed the family's stories, objects moving when Craig entered a room, voices calling his name, figures seen in mirrors. One story chilled her. A child Craig once spoke to nobody in his room, laughing, then cried when asked who it was. The cousin said the family avoided discussing it, fearing it might notice them. Sarah found an old book in a thrift store. Its pages yellowed, about local folklore. It mentioned companions, entities that latched on to certain people, neither good nor evil, but jealous, showing themselves to those who doubted. The book's final line haunted her. They never leave, but they might let you go. She burned the book, hoping to sever any lingering tie. Some nights, though, she wakes, certain she hears a faint knock or sees a grin in the window's reflection. Sarah remains a skeptic, but can't explain those experiences, and they resurface every year, though they happened at a different time. The shadow that followed Craig might still be out of there, waiting for someone new to doubt its existence. Story number 4. The house on Elmwood Street stood like a bruise against the gray Ohio sky, its sagging porch and peeling paint whispering of better days long gone. Inside, a family fractured by secrets and sorrow tried to stitch their lives together, unaware that something else had already claimed the space, something that fed on their pain. The air inside was thick, not just with the stale smell of old wood, but with a weight that pressed against the chest, making every breath feel stolen. Claire, barely 20, moved through the rooms with a quiet dread, her eyes catching shadows that lingered too long in corners. It started with a feeling, a prickle at the back of her neck, as if someone stood just behind her, breathing softly. At night, the house seemed to hum a low guttural sound that wasn't quite sound, vibrating through the walls and into her bones. Then the scratches appeared, faint at first, like careless marks from a thorn. They bloomed across Claire's skin, her thighs, her back, places she couldn't reach. She woke each morning with her heart pounding, her blankets twisted as if someone had tried to drag her away in her sleep. No one else noticed, or if they did, they didn't care. The family was drowning in their own chaos, addiction, betrayal, rage. But Claire knew whatever was in the house wasn't just watching her, it was haunting her. The house in Martins Ferry, Ohio, was a patchwork of forgotten dreams, a duplex clumsily stitched into a single, sprawling structure. It had 2 floors, 6 bedrooms, 4 on the second floor, 2 on the ground floor, 1 bathroom right next to Claire's bedroom, and a very short basement. The ceilings in the basement grazed Claire's head. She was tall, nearly 6 feet, and the damp air down there clung to her skin like a warning. Claire lived there with her 2 older brothers, A and E, 22 and little sister, Aish. Their rooms were on the second floor, as well as her mother and stepfather, 2 and 4 respectively. The family had moved in after the housing crash, chasing a fresh start in a town where the streets felt older than the hills. They had previously experienced paranormal activity in other homes they lived in. This wasn't something unusual or frightening because they lived in an oldish city. Strange noises, fleeting shadows, the occasional whiff of something sour. These were just part of life. But this house was different. It didn't just creak, it watched. Claire's older sister, Delilah, hadn't been part of the move at first. She lived with her husband at the time along with their 2 small children. Her husband was financially abusive and was also an addict who got Delilah addicted as well. Delilah's life was unraveling, her husband draining their money on drugs, leaving her stranded with empty cupboards and 2 hungry kids. One day, Delilah called Claire, crying because her husband had spent all of her money on drugs, left her car on empty, and had left her alone at home with the children, and they had no food to eat. Claire didn't hesitate. She spoke with her mother, and they came up with a game plan to get her sister out. Claire advised her to pack up everything she could fit in the car, pack up the kids, and meet her at the gas station. At the gas station, Claire filled Delilah's tank, handed her a pack of cigarettes, and held her as she sobbed. She lived a short 20-minute drive away across the river, and Claire met her at the gas station. And while she filled her car with gas, she hugged her as she cried. They drove back to the house together, Delilah's kids asleep in the back seat, their small faces pale under the streetlights. But Delilah brought more than her pain. Due to all of the negative energy, something dark seemed to have attached to her as well. The house changed the moment Delilah arrived. The first thing Claire remembered was just how dreary the house felt after she had moved in. The light seemed dimmer, the air heavier, as if the walls were soaking up Delilah's despair. Delilah's addiction worsened. She lost her nursing job after stealing meds. She eventually was fired from her job as a nurse because she had been caught stealing meds from her patients. Her husband followed her to the house, unable to pay their old rent, and brought his own chaos, drugs, lies, and a jealousy that turned Delilah against Claire. She decided to get back with her husband, and he moved in because he couldn't afford their house payments due to spending all his money on drugs. Delilah's paranoia festered. She assumed that Claire was trying to sleep with her husband because Claire tried to be civil around him. Claire, engaged to her fiancé Jay, had no interest in her sister's husband. But Delilah's accusations led to a day of screaming and near violence. After a day full of her sister trying to physically attack her, this is when this dark thing started to materialize. That night, Claire felt it, a presence, cold and deliberate, watching her from the shadows of her bedroom. At night, she would be in bed and to feel like something was watching her. It wasn't just a feeling, it was a weight, a certainty that something was there, its gaze boring into her. Anytime she was doing schoolwork, she felt like someone was standing behind her while she sat at her desk in her bedroom. Her books would shift slightly, her pens rolling to the floor when no one else was in the room. Things in her room were being moved around when nobody else was able to get into her room. The disturbances grew bolder. Her blankets would be pulled off in her sleep. She'd wake, gasping, her covers tangled at the foot of the bed. She started hearing someone walking around her room at night as well. The footsteps were heavy, deliberate, circling her bed in the dark. Then came the scratches. She would wake up with random scratches on her legs, on her back, where she couldn't reach them. They burned, appearing overnight in places no human hand could touch. One night, the terror escalated. Claire was grabbed by her leg and ripped off her bed by something she wasn't able to see. She hit the floor hard, her breath knocked out of her, the room spinning. She was not a small woman by any means, so it would take someone quite strong to yank her that hard and that fast off of her bed in a dead weight, dead sleep like that. The air was thick with malice. And for a moment, she thought she saw a shape formless, darker than the dark, hovering at the edge of her vision. Desperate, Claire tried to fight back. She lit some sage to cleanse her room and started chanting a protection spell over and over again for nearly half an hour. The smoke curled upward, but the presence didn't leave. It seemed to mock her, the footsteps growing louder. That same night, Jay called her in a panic. Her fiancé, Jay, Tony, at the time, called her extremely upset, telling her that something was in his house outside of his room, and he felt like he was going to be attacked if he left his room. His voice shook as he described a low, guttural sound, like an animal, but worse, pacing outside his door. The next day, Claire drove to Jay's house, a small place in the town where she'd grown up. She went over to his house. He lived in a town that she grew up in, where her sister and her whole family lived before they moved into this new house. The door to Jay's room was marred with deep, jagged scratches, as if something had clawed at it for hours. There were literal gouged scratches in his wooden door from where whatever it was had been waiting, apparently. Claire's heart sank. She asked him if she had left anything at his house within the last few days and looked around and saw her watch on the windowsill by his bed. The watch, a cheap silver thing she'd worn for years, felt wrong in her hand, heavier than it should have been. Something was telling her that whatever this thing was, it was now fixated on her. The realization hit her like a blow. The entity wasn't just tied to the house or Delilah's pain. It had chosen Claire, following her, marking her. The scratches on her body weren't random. They were a claim. She stopped sleeping. Her night spent sitting up with a flashlight, listening for the footsteps that never failed to come. The house grew colder, the dreariness seeping into everyone. Her brothers argued constantly. Her little sister withdrew. Her mother's eyes grew hollow. Claire tried to research the house's history, digging through old records at the library. The duplex had been built in the 1920s, home to a string of families plagued by loss, suicide, overdoses, disappearances. A previous tenant, a woman in the 1950s, had claimed something lived in the walls, scratching at her until she fled. The stories were buried, dismissed as madness, but Claire knew better. She confronted Delilah, begging her to leave the house, to get clean, to break the cycle of pain that seemed to feed the entity. But Delilah laughed, her eyes glassy, and accused Claire of jealousy. The next night, the entity struck again. Claire woke to find her bedroom door ajar, the hallway beyond pitch black. The footsteps were there, but this time they didn't circle. They came straight for her. She screamed, and for a split second she saw it. A shape. Humanoid, but wrong, its edges fraying like burnt cloth, its eyes two burning points of light. Claire fled the house that night, staying with Jay until she could afford to move out. She never returned, but the scratches followed her for months, fading slowly as if the entity was reluctant to let go. Delilah and her husband spiraled deeper into addiction, eventually losing custody of their kids. The house was sold, then abandoned. Its windows boarded up like eyes closed against the world. Years later, Claire heard from a neighbor that the house had been demolished. The workers reported strange things, tools vanishing, scratches appearing on their arms, a low hum that made their ears bleed. Claire wasn't surprised. Whatever had clung to her, to Delilah, to that cursed house, wasn't gone. It was waiting, patient as the dark, for the next family to claim. Story number 5. The dorm room was a tomb of shadows, the kind of dark that swallowed every sound, every breath. Mara, a college sophomore, lay in her bed, the world beyond her eyelids a void. It was late, and I was sleeping soundly when I randomly woke up for whatever reason. Something had stirred her, a prickling at the base of her neck, like a warning whispered by the night itself. She sat up, her heart thudding, and froze. At the foot of my bed in the pitch dark was a man. Not a man, not really, just a shape, blacker than the dark, with glowing red eyes that burned into her soul. Those eyes didn't blink, didn't waver, just bored into her, pinning her in place like a moth under glass. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. The figure didn't shift, didn't speak, just sat there, its presence a weight that crushed the air from the room. I remember locking eyes with him for a split second. Mara's throat tightened, a weak cry escaping her lips before instinct took over. I instantly hid under my blankets. You know, because that will protect you from supernatural entities, right? The blanket was her shield, a child's defense against the unknown. She counted her breaths, each one shaky, waiting for the thing to leave. But when she peeked out, it was still there, its red eyes glowing brighter, as if daring her to look again. The room felt alive, the walls pulsing with malice. Mara's mind raced. Was this a dream? She'd always been a skeptic, a doubting Thomas type, dismissing the shadow people she'd seen as a kid, the voices that called her name when no one was there. As a kid, I did used to see shadow people all the time and have heard strange things. But this was different. This was real. I felt wide awake after locking eyes with whatever that thing was. My heart was racing quickly, too. She ducked back under the blankets, her body trembling. I think I just fell back asleep with my head under the blankets. When morning came, the figure was gone, but its gaze lingered in her mind, a stain she couldn't wash away. Her roommate, oblivious, slept through it all. My roommate said that she didn't hear me scream or anything, so I really don't know what to think of it. Mara tried to tell her friends, but they laughed it off, insisting she'd dreamed it. I talked to some of my friends about it, though, and they said that I must have been dreaming, but I really don't think so. She knew better. Those eyes weren't a dream, they were a promise, a warning. What was it? The Hat Man, like the stories she'd heard, or something older, something hungrier. She pushed the thought away, but it clung to her, following her through the years, a shadow at the edge of her vision. Years later, the pest came calling. Mara stood alone in an old cemetery, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and forgotten lives. I was visiting an old cemetery in Richmond, VA, and came across a grave covered with evil eye necklaces, rose quartz crystals, and the like. The grave was a shrine, adorned with offerings, but it was the jar that caught her eye, a glass vessel at the foot of the stone, filled with a picture of a lady inside and a bunch of broken mirror shards. The jar seemed to hum, its contents glowing faintly in the twilight, pulling her closer despite the warning in her gut. Mara's skepticism, honed over years of dismissing the strange, wavered. I was intrigued and went to take a closer look. The cemetery was silent. the other graves fading into the mist. Then she heard it, a rapid, insistent whispering, like a chorus of voices crowding her ears. I remember hearing whispering near my ear of like voices speaking rapidly. She was alone, or so she thought. I was alone in this part of the cemetery, but my idiot self for some reason said, "Hello? Anyone there?" The whispering grew louder, closer. As if answering her call, it wasn't just sound, it was a presence, wrapping around her, tugging at her thoughts. She'd always respected cemeteries, never touching what didn't belong to her. I don't really ever touch things in cemeteries, but the jar was different. I felt really compelled to touch this jar. Her hand hovered over it, drawn by a force she couldn't name. Her mind screamed to run, to flee, but her body stayed rooted, calm in a way that terrified her. My brain was screaming for me to run, but my heart and body were just perfectly calm. The air thickened, pressing against her skin. The air felt sort of pressurized as well. She forced herself to move, to run, but it was like wading through a dream. Each step heavy, deliberate. In fact, in the end, I sort of had to force myself to run, and it felt like I was running in a dream, almost. As she fled, pain shot through her foot, sharp and sudden, like a sprain from nowhere. As I ran, my foot started hurting like I'd sprained it. The grave's pull lingered, a magnetic force that clawed at her back. The grave had this sort of magnetism to it. She stumbled through the cemetery, the whispering fading but never gone. The pain didn't stop until she reached her car, the engine's hum a lifeline back to reality. It didn't stop hurting until I made it back to my car and eventually drove home. She didn't look back, but she felt it. The grave, the jar, watching her go. Back home, Mara couldn't shake the encounter, but my question for all of you is, what does a jar with broken mirror shards mean? She asked friends who dabbled in witchcraft, but they only warned her to stay away. I have asked my witchcraft practicing friends, and they aren't sure. They just said that the situation was bad and dangerous, and that I probably should just not go back there. The jar haunted her. Its image burned into her mind. Was it a ward, a curse, or something worse? She began to wonder if the cemetery was connected to the figure in her dorm, those red eyes that had never left her. Mara's nights grew restless, her dreams filled with crimson light and shattered glass. One night, she woke to find her bedroom mirror cracked, a single, jagged line running through its center. She hadn't touched it, hadn't heard it break. The air in her apartment felt wrong, heavy, like the cemetery all over again. She covered the mirror, but the feeling didn't leave. At night, she'd catch glimpses of movement in reflective surfaces, her phone screen, a glass of water, always just out of sight. She stopped sleeping, her days blurring into a haze of fear and questions, desperate for answers. Mara returned to the library, digging into Richmond's history. The cemetery, she learned, was tied to a woman named Eliza, a healer in the 18s who'd been shunned for her practices. Rumor said she'd bound her spirit to the land, using mirrors to trap her essence, to watch the world she'd left behind. The jar, with its broken shards and photograph, might have been her anchor, a vessel for her will. Mara's stomach churned. Had she disturbed Eliza's rest? Had she invited those red eyes back into her life? The encounters grew bolder. One evening, as Mara walked home, the streetlights flickered, casting long, unnatural shadows. She felt eyes on her, the same burning gaze from years ago in her apartment. Objects began to move, a book falling from a shelf, a door creaking open on its own. She bought protective charms, hung evil eye beads above her door, but the presence lingered. Knocks. Her neighbor's dog growled at her doorway, refusing to enter, his hackles raised. Mara knew she couldn't ignore it anymore. The jar, the figure, Eliza, they were all connected, a puzzle she'd unwittingly begun to solve. Mara sought out a local medium, an older woman named Ruth who knew the town's secrets. Ruth's face darkened as Mara described the jar, the whispering, the red-eyed figure. "You've crossed a threshold," Ruth said. "Some spirits don't rest. They watch, they wait, and you've caught their eye." She explained that broken mirrors could be a trap, a way to bind a spirit or amplify its power. The photograph in the jar was likely Eliza's, a tether to her unfinished business. Mara had awakened something by approaching the grave, something that now saw her as its own. Ruth offered to perform a ritual to sever the connection, but it required returning to the cemetery, facing the grave again. Mara hesitated. The memory of the whispering, the pain in her foot, still fresh. Could she face those eyes again? The crimson gaze that had haunted her for years? But the disturbances didn't stop. One night, she found a shard of glass on her kitchen counter, its edge sharp and identical to those in the jar. It hadn't been there before. She wrapped it in cloth, her hands shaking, and buried it in her backyard, hoping to break the link. But the air grew heavier, the shadows longer. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror flickered, showing not her face, but Eliza's, her eyes glowing red. Mara began to see the figure again, not just in dreams, but in waking moments. It stood at the edge of her vision, a silhouette against the streetlights, its eyes burning through the dark. She stopped, leaving her apartment, afraid of what might follow her. Ruth called, urging her to act before it was too late. The ritual required salt, sage, and a mirror to reflect the spirit's gaze back upon itself. Mara gathered the supplies, her resolve hardening. She couldn't live like this, trapped by a presence she'd unleashed. The night of the ritual, Mara drove to the cemetery, Ruth by her side. The grave was unchanged, the jar still glowing faintly in the moonlight. The whispering returned, louder now, a cacophony of voices that clawed at her mind. Ruth chanted, sprinkling salt around the grave, while Mara held the mirror, her hands trembling. The air crackled, the ground beneath them trembling as the jar began to shake. Mara stared into the mirror, and there it was, the figure, its red eyes blazing, its form solidifying. "You saw me," it hissed, its voice a blade. "Now you're mine." Ruth's chanting grew louder, and Mara forced herself to hold the mirror steady. The figure lunged, its hands reaching through the glass, but the salt circle held. The jar shattered, its contents spilling across the grave, and the figure screamed, a sound that tore through the night. The mirror cracked in Mara's hands, but the figure was gone. The whispering silenced. Mara collapsed, her breath ragged, the pain in her foot gone. Ruth helped her to the car, the cemetery falling silent behind them. But as they drove away, Mara glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. A faint red glow lingered, watching her go. Story number 6. The house on Elm Street stood like a forgotten monument, its 2 stories looming over the quiet Kansas town. Most folks avoided it, whispering tales of shadows, shubas, and sounds that didn't belong. But for Sarah and her young son, Tommy, it was home, a fresh start bought with blood money from a tragedy she'd barely survived. On a crisp fall night, they returned from a friend's house, the air heavy with the promise of sleep. The old place looked as it always did, weathered but proud. Its upstairs windows glowing softly through heavy curtains. Sarah parked by the garage, 100 feet from the back door, and helped Tommy out of the car. The boy clung to her hand, his small frame shivering in the chill. They trudged up the path to the laundry room, the familiar creak of the door welcoming them. Inside, the kitchen was dim, lit only by the faint glow spilling from the living room. Sarah yawned, ready to tuck Tommy in and collapse. But as they stepped into the house, something felt off, a weight in the air, like the house was holding its breath. They crossed into the living room, the floorboards groaning under their feet. That's when it hit them, a sound, sharp and deliberate, from somewhere above. Footsteps, not the settling of an old house, but heavy, purposeful steps, pacing the upstairs hallway. Sarah froze, her grip tightening on Tommy's hand. The boy looked up, wide-eyed, sensing her fear. She forced a smile, but her heart pounded. No one else was home. No one should be up there. The footsteps grew louder, more insistent, as if testing the house's limits. Sarah's eyes darted to the staircase, its dark mouth leading to the unlit hallway above. The bedroom lights, always left on to chase away the shadows, were out. Someone or something had turned them off. The steps became stomps, shaking the walls, vibrating through the floor. Tommy whimpered, pressing closer to his mother. Sarah's voice trembled as she called out, hoping for an answer, praying for silence. No answer came. The stomping stopped for a heartbeat, then surged again, racing down the hallway toward the stairs. Sarah and Tommy stood rooted, staring into the darkness, waiting for whatever was coming to step into the light. The steps thundered closer, each one a hammer blow to their nerves. They reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. Nothing, no figure, no shadow, just the empty staircase staring back. Sarah's breath caught, her mind screaming that this wasn't right, that something was terribly wrong. We walked through the kitchen and into the living room, and that was when we heard it. Footsteps somewhere inside of the house. Sarah's first thought was an intruder, but the house was locked tight, the windows secure. She called out, her voice echoing in the stillness. Mom called out, "Hello," but there was no response, just more footsteps. Tommy clung to her leg, his small hands trembling. She wanted to run, to scoop him up and flee, but curiosity or something deeper held her there. They moved cautiously toward the front of the house. Stopping at the foot of the stairs, Mom and I made the trek to the front of the house. Stopping near the foot of the stairs, the living room's light spilled over the bottom steps, but beyond that, the staircase vanished into shadow. The light from the living room bled over the bottom few stairs into the smaller living room on the other side. Sarah's eyes strained to see, but the darkness was absolute. But looking up the staircase was looking up into complete darkness at this point. The footsteps returned, heavier now, deliberate. The footsteps were getting more intense, though, like most old houses, When something is dropped or someone is stomping on the floor, you pretty much feel it everywhere. Sarah called again, her voice sharper. One last time. My mom called out, "Who's running around up there?" Silence, then a rush of stomps, moving down the hallway, down the stairs. Then they started almost running down the staircase. Sarah and Tommy stood frozen, braced for something to appear. The stomping stopped right at the foot of the stairs, but there was nothing there. The silence was worse than the noise. Sarah's heart thundered, her mind racing for an explanation. Had she imagined it? But Tommy had heard it too, his small body shaking against her. Then, as if mocking them, the stomping started again, retreating up the stairs, fading into the hallway. Then, as quickly as it stopped, the stomping started again, back up the stairs, around the banister, and down the hallway. Sarah grabbed Tommy, her instincts finally overriding her fear. Mom picked me up and ran back to the car. They sped back to their friend Jake's house, Sarah's hands shaking on the wheel. Tommy sat sullen, staring out the window, too young to understand but old enough to feel the wrongness. At Jake's, Sarah spilled the story, her words tumbling over each other. And once we got there, Mom told Jay what we had seen. Jake, ever the skeptic, laughed it off. "There's no way. Someone must be messing with you, Jan," he said. But Sarah's desperation convinced him to come back with them. They approached the house cautiously, entering through the front door this time. We pulled up to the front of the house this time, not even bothering with the back door that we usually came through. Jake led the way, his bravado fading as they stepped inside. Jay opened the door first and we all walked in. The air felt heavier now, the house somehow darker, despite the familiar glow of the living room. They gathered at the stairs, and it happened again. Standing at the foot of the stairs, just where Mom and I had been 20 minutes ago, we heard the same stomps as before. Jake's face hardened. Instantly, Jay said, "Watch. We're going to go outside and find the ladder that they climbed up to get into your house." They circled the house, checking windows, doors, anything that could explain an intruder. We went outside and found, of course, no ladder or any other way that someone could have broken in. Back inside, the stomps returned, louder, more defiant, stopping just short of the light. We went back inside, and it happened again all the way to the bottom of the stairs again, right in front of Mom, Jay, and myself. Jake's confidence crumbled. Jay ushered us outside at this point and said, "How about you guys stay at my place tonight?" They didn't argue. The three of them spent the night at Jake's. Sarah and Tommy curled up on his couch, the boy clinging to his mother even in sleep. The house on Elm Street felt like a living thing now, watching them from across town, waiting for their return. Morning came, and with it, a fragile courage. The next morning, we went back. The sunlight was shining in, illuminating the upstairs hallway. Sarah, Tommy, and Jake returned, stepping cautiously into the house. When we made it to the top of the stairs, everything was normal. Nothing was misplaced. No windows were broken or left open. The upstairs hallway was bright, the bedrooms untouched. It was as if nothing had happened, as if the night's terror had been a dream. But Sarah knew better. Tommy's voice, Jake's shaken demeanor, they'd all felt it. The house wasn't just old, it was alive, its walls holding secrets older than the town itself. This is one of the earliest childhood memories that I have. I was just a little guy back then, and I didn't really understand what had happened to me. For Sarah, it was the beginning of a decade in that house. Each year marked by new, unexplainable events. For Tommy, it was the first time he felt fear he couldn't name, a shadow that would follow him long after they left Elm Street. The town still talked about the house, but Sarah and Tommy never shared the full story. Not with neighbors, not with friends. The stomps were just the start, a warning of what the house could do. And though they'd escaped that night, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something in those walls was still waiting, still listening, ready to stir the moment they let their guard down. Story number 7. The farmhouse stood like a sentinel on the edge of Sellville, its weathered stones whispering of centuries past. Built in 1750, it loomed over a vineyard, its windows dark against the rolling Virginia hills. Clara and her family, husband David, daughter Lily, parents, sister Emily, and brother-in-law Mark, arrived expecting a quaint retreat, but the air inside was heavy, as if the house held its breath. The creak of the front door echoed through the oldest part of the cabin, and Clara felt a chill that no summer sun could dispel. Something watched from the shadows, patient and unseen. The kitchen, with its low beams and worn hearth, seemed to swallow sound, each word spoken falling flat. Beyond it, the sitting room led to a library, its shelves sagging under dusty tomes. Clara's parents claimed the first-floor bedroom, but the upstairs felt wrong. The bedroom by the stairs, with its ancient fireplace, sent a shiver down Clara's spine, its air thick with an unspoken warning. She and David chose the room above the kitchen instead, where Lily's crib sat in the corner. Emily and Mark took the top floor, drawn to its solitude and lone window. The first night, Clara lay awake, the silence of the house unnatural, broken only by the hum of the room's AC unit. She dismissed it as fatigue, but the feeling lingered, a pressure behind her eyes. David slept soundly, but Lily stirred, her tiny hands clutching the air. Downstairs, Clara's father, Robert, sat at the kitchen table, his laptop casting a pale glow. He said that he was sitting at the kitchen table on his computer and could hear footsteps walking around the house above him. The sound was deliberate, not the shuffle of family, but he laughed it off, blaming the old house's quirks. By morning, Robert mentioned the footsteps to Clara, his voice light but his eyes uneasy. "My dad asked me about footsteps from the night prior." Clara brushed it aside, noting their room was above the kitchen. "I told him that our room is above the kitchen, and I wouldn't think anything of it." But Robert pressed, describing a bright light outside his window, too vivid for a passing car. He then mentioned that he thought that he saw a bright light shining outside of his window and was tempted to look, but thought better of it. Clara, knowing his penchant for vivid dreams, dismissed it. But a seed of doubt took root. David, ever practical, moved Lily's crib closer to their bed that morning, claiming it was for convenience, randomly too. "My husband asked me to help him move the crib from the other side of our room to be next to our bed." Clara didn't question it, but his eyes lingered on the far corner, where the room's shadows seemed to pool. The house felt alive, its walls absorbing their laughter, its silence louder than their voices. Clara couldn't shake the sense that they weren't alone. that the house was studying them, waiting. The dining room, with its wide window framing the vineyard and distant mountains, offered a brief reprieve. The room is a stunning, picturesque old farmhouse dining room with a big window overlooking the field, shed, and barn with the mountains around us, too. During Robert's birthday dinner, Clara glanced outside and noticed the shed door ajar. I looked outside of the window and noticed the shed door seeming slightly ajar. It swung slightly, then wider, then closed, as if moved by an unseen hand. The door was more open, more closed. She texted David to check it. I texted my husband. Can you go out and check the shed? They watched, stunned, as the door opened fully and closed again. We watched the shed door slowly open itself completely and then just as slowly closed itself shut again. David and Robert investigated, finding no one, and locked the shed. We locked the shed and said that it shouldn't open again. But the incident lingered, a crack in the facade of their vacation. The house's history began to surface in Clara's mind. Its role as a Civil War field hospital where soldiers bled and died on these floors. The vineyard outside had once been a battlefield, its soil soaked in pain. She pushed the thought away, but the house seemed to hum with it, its silence a canvas for whispers of the past. On their third day, the family visited D.C., the house's weight lifting in the city's bustle. But back in Paisleville, the unease returned. David, skeptical of the supernatural, stayed behind one evening to put Lily to bed while Clara joined a Gettysburg ghost tour. When they returned, David's face was pale. My husband, who is naturally very skeptical of ghosts and hypological about everything, said that he heard footsteps upstairs. When he got in, the steps were heavy, echoing in the soundless house. Another thing about the house, too, is that the sound doesn't travel at all. He searched every room, finding nothing, but the experience shook him. So, he checked every room and closet to make sure that nobody was in the house. That night, Clara woke to a faint knocking above her, like fingers tapping the ceiling. A faint vanilla scent hung in the air, sharp and unnatural. I could have sworn that I was hearing a knocking above my head, and also thought that I was smelling vanilla. The ghost tour's stories echoed, townsfolk masking the stench of death with vanilla during the war. On the ghost tour, we learned that the townspeople dealt with the smell of corpses for months, post-war, by dipping face masks in vanilla, lavender, and mint. She tried to sleep, but the house felt closer, its walls pressing in. Morning brought new strangeness. Clara found the kitchen cabinets open, their contents undisturbed but exposed. I noticed that the kitchen cabinets were left open while Lily napped. The baby monitor's camera swiveled downward on its own. I tapped her monitor, and the camera rotated all the way down. Clara's heart raced. Had she bumped it? Or was something else at play? At lunch, Robert claimed he might have left the cabinets open, but his story didn't add up. My dad said that it might have been him. He got my mom a glass of water before bed, apparently, but we all went to bed after him. Emily broke the silence, her voice trembling. My sister mentioned that she woke up in a cold sweat at 3 o'clock in the morning. A whisper in her ear had said, "Don't move." She said that she was having a really weird dream and thought that she heard someone whisper in her ear, "Don't move." She'd seen a flash of light outside, too bright for nature. She said that before bed, her and her husband were watching more videos about Gettysburg and saw a bright flash of light outside the window. David admitted he'd woken at the same hour, drenched in sweat. He said that he also woke up at 3 in the morning in a cold sweat this morning. Emily confessed the fireplace room unnerved her, mirroring Clara's dread. My sister also mentioned that she also hated the first bedroom. There was something about the fireplace that really creeped her out. The family's unease grew, each incident chipping away at their resolve. They debated leaving, but decided to stay one more night. That evening, after dinner, Clara and David found the fireplace room's door ajar, a cold draft pouring out. So when we got home from dinner, the bedroom door that we kept shut was actually cracked open, and then air was coming out of it that was so cold it was like standing directly in front of the AC. David slammed it shut, sparing Emily the sight. It was just my husband and I on the stairs, and we looked at each other, and he quickly shut it before my sister came up. Downstairs, the family huddled, Emily's fear contagious. My family was all huddled together saying, "We need to go." They agreed to leave, packing swiftly. After some discussion, we all decided that it would be best to leave at this point. As they loaded the cars, Clara watched the men check the house. I could see my dad walking into what was our room on the second floor with my husband, and I could see the flashlight scanning the top floor, simultaneously where my sister and brother-in-law slept. But confusion struck. David hadn't been upstairs, nor had Mark. He said that he wasn't up there, that it was my brother-in-law. My dad yelled up the stairs asking if brother-in-law was up there, and husband heard, "Yeah, I'm up here." Mark was in the kitchen. My brother-in-law apparently yelled from the first floor. Though, no, I'm in the kitchen. Robert's flashlight flickered in their room, reviving in the hallway. My dad mentioned that when he went into my room to check it, his flashlight started to die at that point, and when he stepped into the hallway, it came back on. David felt a sudden numbness. My husband agreed and shared when he went into our room with my dad that he felt sort of suddenly numb as well. The keypad locked prematurely, and while my dad was locking the house up on the keypad, he started the 4-digit code and the house locked itself on the second number. Robert's flashlight died again as he discarded the trash, and when he went to throw out the last of the trash, his flashlight started to die again. The house's history as a field hospital loomed large. The house was a Civil War field hospital. Clara imagined soldiers' screams echoing through these walls, their pain seeping into the stones. The Zillow listing mentioned it briefly, buried in praise for the land. And under what the owner loves about the house is one sentence: the house was a Civil War field hospital, and then goes on to talk about the home's 666 acres and nearby locations. No records hinted at hauntings, but the house felt saturated with them. As they drove away, Clara felt the house's gaze on their backs. Needless to say, after all of that, we all felt better about coming home and not spending another night there. Robert texted the owners confessing their early departure. My dad said that we left last night. I'm sure we're not the first to tell you this, but your place is haunted. The owners seemed surprised, claiming no prior reports. The owners were surprised and said that we actually were the first to say so. Their response was curt. They simply said, "Well, it definitely has its history." Months later, Clara couldn't shake the house's hold. The vanilla scent, the whispers, the they weren't just memories, but wounds. She wondered if the soldiers still lingered, their agony trapped in the farmhouse's bones, reaching out to the living. The vineyard stretched silent under the stars. But Clara knew the house was never truly empty. Its unseen guest waited, patient, for the next to cross its threshold. Story number 8. The house was too still. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears until you hear your own heartbeat. Lucas, a lanky high school junior, slumped in his basement chair, the blue glow of his computer screen casting shadows on the walls. His parents wouldn't be home for hours, leaving him alone in their creaky old house. He typed away, lost in a game, when a faint sound broke his focus, a soft thud from upstairs, like a door easing shut. He froze, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. The air felt heavier now, charged with something he couldn't name. Lucas shook his head, telling himself it was just the house settling. But a chill crawled up his spine. Then it came again. Distinct, deliberate footsteps crossing the kitchen above. Lucas's heart skipped. The floorboards groaned under an unseen weight, each step echoing in the silence. He held his breath, straining to listen, half expecting to hear his mom's voice calling his name. But there was nothing, just the steps, slow and purposeful, moving toward the laundry room. A new sound followed, sharp and unmistakable, the click of the garage door latch. Lucas's stomach dropped. The alarm makes a beep when someone opens the exterior door. He remembered, but no beep came. Whoever or whatever was up there hadn't triggered the alarm. The footsteps stopped, replaced by something worse. A woman's voice, low and animated, like she was chatting on a phone. The sound of a woman chatting loudly like she was talking on a cell phone drifted through the ceiling. Her words indistinct, but her tone casual, as if she belonged there. Lucas's mind raced, thinking that his mom had come home early. He went upstairs to see her. He crept up the basement stairs, his hand trembling on the railing. At the top, he pushed the door open and froze. The house was pitch black, the kind of dark that swallows light. When he opened the basement door, he was greeted with a pitch black house. Lucas fumbled for the light switch, his voice barely a whisper. "Mom!" he called. Silence. Hello?" No response. The darkness seemed to pulse, alive with the absence of sound. He flipped on the kitchen light, revealing empty counters, a sink full of dishes, and no sign of life. He discovered that all the doors were locked. There were no cars in the garage, and really nothing was missing. His breath hitched as he checked the garage, empty, the car bay cold and still. Yet the woman's voice had been so clear, her footsteps so real. Where had she gone? Fear clawed at Lucas's chest, urging him to retreat. He went back to the safety of the basement, locking the door behind him, though he knew a flimsy lock wouldn't stop whatever was in the house. He sat in front of his computer, the screen now a mocking reminder of normalcy. Every creak, every sigh of the house felt like a threat. He texted his mom. "Were you home just now?" Her reply came an hour later. "Of course. She said that she wasn't." Lucas's blood ran cold. If it wasn't his mom, who or what had been walking through their kitchen, talking as if they lived there? The incident haunted Lucas. He stopped staying home alone, opting for the library after school, but the house never felt the same. He'd catch himself listening for footsteps, for that ghostly voice, even when his parents were home. What if she was still there? waiting in the shadows, her presence tied to the house itself. He researched the property's history, uncovering a vague record of a previous owner, a woman who'd lived alone, her fate unlisted. Was she the one he'd heard, her voice echoing through time? Lucas installed a cheap security camera, but it caught nothing. Yet at night, when the house was quiet, he swore he heard whispers, faint and fleeting, calling his name. Story number 9. The old house in Norfolk creaked under the weight of its own secrets, its wooden bones groaning as the night deepened. 15-year-old Ethan lay awake in his cousin's room, the air thick with the musty scent of a place that hadn't been aired out in years. Outside, the wind clawed at the windows, rattling the panes like it wanted in. Ethan didn't believe in ghosts, but something about this house made his skin crawl. He glanced at his cousin, Caleb, sprawled across the bed, whispering about school and old times. The single lamp between them flickered, casting jagged shadows on the walls. Ethan laughed it off. Old wiring, probably. But then the lamp dimmed again, and a cold draft slithered across his neck. Though the windows were shut tight, he froze, his breath catching. The house was listening. Caleb's voice dropped, his eyes darting to the door. "You ever hear something you can't explain?" he asked, his tone no longer playful. Ethan shook his head, but his heart thudded. Caleb leaned closer, his whisper barely audible. "This house, it's not right. Things move, lights go out, and sometimes late at night you hear it, knocks. Always 3, never where you expect." Ethan's mouth went dry. He wanted to laugh, but the air felt heavier now, pressing against his chest. As if on cue, a low thud echoed from somewhere deep in the house. Not the wind, not a pipe, something deliberate, like a fist against wood. Ethan's eyes locked on the door, its chipped paint glowing faintly in the lamplight. Caleb sat up, his face pale. The thud came again, closer from the direction of the kitchen. Ethan's pulse roared in his ears. Whatever was out there was moving. The floorboards groaned under invisible weight, each creak deliberate, drawing nearer. The sound wasn't right. Too slow, too heavy, like a child dragging oversized shoes. Ethan gripped the edge of the bed, his knuckles white. The steps stopped just outside their door. Silence swallowed the room, thick and suffocating. Then 3 sharp knocks, loud, unmistakable, rang out, not from their door, but from across the hall. Ethan's blood turned to ice. Ethan and his family were visiting his cousins in Norfolk, Virginia, a rare reunion after years apart. He stayed in his younger cousin's room with him and his brother. In his older cousin's room, the house was old, its layout sprawling. The bedrooms were at the end of a hallway. His brother's room was at the end of the hallway. His bedroom was across from his aunt and uncle's bedroom. His parents stayed at the opposite end of the house in the den. That first night, Ethan and Caleb stayed up late, catching up after lights out. During their talk, Caleb casually told him that the house was haunted by a woman. He didn't remember why they thought it was a woman, but he told Ethan that the lights would go out unexpectedly from time to time, and there'd be strange noises late at night. The most common happening was that the TV in the den would turn on in the middle of the night without explanation. Ethan was curious, half skeptical, but the stories planted a seed of unease. They moved on to other topics, but the house seemed to hum with a strange energy. like it was waiting. In the early hours, there was a loud, heavy-sounding thud that sounded like it came from the kitchen. Ethan and Caleb froze, their voices dying. They heard what sounded like footsteps slowly coming down the hallway towards the bedrooms. The floors were hardwood, and to Ethan, the footfall sounded like a small child that had put on their parents' shoes. They slid, and then the heel would slap the floor. The steps paused outside their door, the silence deafening. Then 3 loud knocks, not on their door, but on his brother's room door. They leapt from the bed, flinging the door open. Ethan's brother and cousin had already opened their door and were standing there, but there was nothing there. Across the hall, Ethan's uncle stumbled out, grumbling about the noise. He cursed them out and sent them off to bed. Ethan's father's snoring rumbled from the den, ruling him out as the source. The boys exchanged wide-eyed looks, but no one had answers. Ethan's heart wouldn't slow. He didn't sleep that night. The next day, the house felt different, darker. Though the sun blazed outside, Ethan noticed things he hadn't before. A faint scratch on the hallway wall, like nails dragged across plaster. A cold spot near the kitchen that made his breath fog. Caleb swore he'd seen a shadow flit across the den. Too quick to be human, Ethan laughed it off. But his voice shook. He didn't want to believe, but the knocks lingered in his mind, sharp and real. That night, Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Caleb was out cold, but Ethan couldn't relax. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that hid something. Then it started again, a thud from the kitchen, followed by those dragging footsteps. Ethan's stomach dropped. He shook Caleb awake, whispering, "It's back." They listened, barely breathing, as the steps grew louder, closer. This time, they stopped at Ethan's door. Silence. Then 3 knocks, slow and deliberate, right on their door. Ethan didn't move. Caleb's eyes were wide, his hand gripping Ethan's arm. The doorknob rattled just once, then stopped. Ethan's mind raced. No one was out there. His uncle would have yelled. His brother would have come running. But something was. He didn't know how he knew, but he felt it, like a weight pressing against the door. The next morning, Ethan's aunt found a small, cracked porcelain doll in the kitchen, tucked behind a cabinet. No one in the family owned it. Caleb swore it hadn't been there before. Ethan's uncle laughed it off, but his aunt's face paled. She whispered to Ethan's mother about the house's history, a woman who'd lived there decades ago, alone, grieving a lost child. She died in the kitchen, her body found weeks later. Ethan overheard, and his blood ran cold. The final night, Ethan didn't sleep. Every sound, the wind, the creaks, the distant hum of the TV flicking on in the den felt like a warning. He kept his eyes on the door, waiting for the knocks. They never came, but the air grew heavy, like something was standing just out of sight, watching. When Ethan's family left, he never returned to that house. Years later, Caleb told him the knocks continued, always 3, always at night. The doll was gone one day, vanished without a trace. Ethan still dreams of that hallway, the hardwood echoing with footsteps that don't belong. Some houses hold on to their ghosts, and some ghosts never let go. Ethan learned that in Norfolk, in a house that still waits, still knocks for someone to answer. Story number 10. The house was too quiet that morning. The kind of silence that presses against your ears until you hear your own heartbeat. Emma, barely a teenager. stood in the kitchen, clutching a box of Cheerios for her dog, Stephanie. But the air felt wrong, like the walls were holding their breath. Stephanie, a tiny terrier, had been at her feet moments ago, her eyes bright with anticipation. Now she was gone, vanished. The pantry door creaked shut behind Emma, and a chill crawled up her spine. Something was watching. She called Stephanie's name, her voice echoing through the empty house. No patter of paws, no jingle of a collar, only the faint hum of the refrigerator and something else. A low, rhythmic thump like a heartbeat in the walls. Emma's younger brother, Liam, was upstairs, lost in his comics. He hadn't noticed the shift, the way the light seemed to dim, the way the house felt alive. Emma's hands trembled. She wasn't alone. Then, from the upstairs hallway, a sharp, desperate yelp. Stephanie. But it wasn't just a cry, it was a scream, raw and terrified, like the dog was pleading for her life. The house wasn't just haunted, it was hungry. I've dealt with paranormal experiences throughout my life, and I am now convinced that some kind of spirit follows my family from time to time. The old house on Maple Street had always been strange. Creaks in the night, shadows that moved too slowly. But that morning, it was different. Emma, barely 13, was home alone with her brother, Liam, and their dog, Stephanie, a scrappy terrier obsessed with Cheerios. We had this little dog named Stephanie, a tiny ball of energy who was completely obsessed with Cheerios. Emma headed to the pantry, Stephanie bouncing at her heels. That morning, I went to the pantry to grab some Cheerios for Stephanie. She was right there beside me, practically bouncing with excitement. She grabbed the box, turned, and froze. I grabbed the box, turned around, and just like that, she was gone. The house swallowed the dog's presence. Emma's calls went unanswered, her voice bouncing off the walls. I immediately started searching the entire house, calling her name over and over. The living room, the kitchen, the basement, nothing. 2 hours passed and panic set in. 2 hours went by and still no sign of her. At this point, I was really worried. Emma grabbed Stephanie's favorite toy, a squeaky pig, and squeezed it in her last-ditch effort. I grabbed her favorite squeaky toy, a little pig that she adored, and squeezed it. A faint sound came from upstairs, and out of nowhere, she appeared upstairs in the hallway, right in front of my brother's room. Stephanie stood there, her small body trembling, eyes wide with fear. Emma's relief was short-lived. I called out to her, "Come down here. I have your Cheerios and your squeaky pig toy." But Stephanie didn't move. But instead of coming to me, she started walking back and forth, crying like she was stuck or maybe scared or something. Her whines grew sharper, more desperate. Emma climbed the stairs, her heart pounding. I kept urging her to come to me, but her crying only grew louder and more desperate. The air thickened, the temperature dropping with each step. So I started climbing the stairs, but the higher I went, the louder her cries became. At the top, a searing pain tore down Emma's back, 5 sharp lines like claws. When I reached the top, I suddenly felt something scratch down my back, 5 distinct fingers. Emma stumbled forward, grabbing Stephanie. Liam burst from his room, pale and wide-eyed. My brother heard me screaming and burst out of his room, totally freaked out. Emma gasped. Something scratched me. Then it started, a deafening thump against the walls, rhythmic and relentless. I told him that something had scratched me, and then out of nowhere we both started hearing this loud banging on the walls. They ran to the solarium, slamming the glass door behind them. So, without thinking, I grabbed Stephanie and my brother and I ran downstairs to the solarium, which had a glass door. But the thumping followed, now pounding on the glass, but then the banging started again. This time on the glass door itself. No one was there, just empty air. We could see through it, and I can assure you that there was no one there. The house seemed to pulse with malice. Emma and Liam clung to each other, Stephanie whimpering in Emma's arms. They called their mother, pleading for her to come home. We called our mom, begging her to come home immediately, but she didn't believe us. She thought they were joking. Hours later, when the thumping stopped, Liam checked Emma's back. But later, when things finally calmed down, my brother checked my back. And sure enough, I had 5 scratch marks running down my skin. The marks were shallow, but unmistakable. And that was really the only time that I was ever physically attacked by, well, that spirit. The aftermath left Emma shaken. The house never felt safe again. Stephanie, once a bundle of joy, became skittish, refusing to go near the upstairs hallway. Emma and Liam avoided the solarium, its glass door now a reminder of that unseen force. Their mother, skeptical at first, grew quiet when she saw the scratches. She never spoke of it, but she started leaving lights on at night. The family had always known something followed them, small signs like whispers or fleeting shapes. It usually just shows up as little shadows peeking around corners or strange noises in the middle of the night. But this was different, violent, personal. Emma began researching the house's history. The previous owners, an elderly couple, had died in a fire decades ago. Trapped in the upstairs bedroom, locals whispered about a third presence, something that lingered after the flames. Emma wondered if it was tied to the scratches, the thumping. It makes me wonder, too, if another one entered my home that day, because it's so odd and out of character that it just seems, well, different. The house's walls seemed to hold memories, and not all of them were human. Stephanie's sudden disappearance, her cries, felt like a lure, as if the house had used her to draw Emma upstairs. Years later, the family moved, but the memory clung to Emma like a shadow. She'd catch Stephanie staring at walls, her ears perked, as if hearing something no one else could. The scratches faded, but the fear didn't. Emma learned to live with the unexplained, but she never trusted old houses again. The thumping, the claws, the way the house seemed to breathe, it was more than a spirit. It was a warning. The family's strange follower had always been subtle, but that day it showed its teeth. And Emma knew, deep down, it was still out there, waiting for the next quiet moment to strike. Story number 11. The dusk was bleeding into night. The sky a bruise of orange and purple over the rolling hills. Tessa, a 12-year-old dog groomer, walked along the gravel path, her poodle mix Lahi prancing at her side, bows bouncing in her fluffy fur. The countryside was quiet, save for the hum of the highway nearby, its lights flickering like distant stars. Tessa loved these walks, the solitude of the semi-remote neighborhood. But tonight, something felt off. The air was too still, the shadows too deep, as if the world was holding its breath. She glanced over her shoulder. her pulse quickening. Nothing but empty road and dilapidated houses, their windows like hollow eyes. Yet the hairs on her neck stood up, a primal warning she couldn't shake. Tessa tightened her grip on Lahi's leash, her boots crunching louder on the gravel. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it, a figure, tall and shrouded in a hoodie, standing motionless by an abandoned house. He was watching her, and he wasn't trying to hide it. The man didn't move, didn't speak, but his presence was a weight, a threat woven into the fading light. Tessa's heart pounded, her mind screaming to run. But was she forced herself to keep walking, to act normal? Lahi, oblivious, tugged at the leash, chasing a scent. Tessa's eyes darted back again. The man was closer now, keeping a steady 30 feet, his steps silent but deliberate. He was following her, and the realization hit like ice water. She quickened her pace, the highway's roar growing louder as she neared it. The man matched her speed, his hoodie obscuring his face, but she could feel his gaze, sharp and unrelenting. Tessa crossed the highway, a car speeding past, and for a moment she thought she'd lost him. But when she looked back, he was there, crossing too, his shadow stretching long and thin across the asphalt. He wasn't stopping, and neither could she. By the time Tessa reached the house at the bottom of the hill, her breath was ragged, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the keys. Lahi sensed it now. Her ears pricked, a low growl rumbling in her throat. Tessa slammed the door shut, locking it, her heart a drum beat in her chest. She was safe. She had to be. But then the door handle rattled, and a voice, cold, hollow, rehearsed, cut through the wood. "I love your dog. Can I meet her? My boyfriend's home is in a semi-remote area at the bottom of a hill at the back of a few arches of property. He's right next to the highway, which has opposite it a small rural neighborhood." The house was a sturdy single-story building, its white paint peeling under the relentless sun. Inside, it smelled of pine and dog fur, a comforting mix for Tessa, who'd spent days here watching over her boyfriend's property. Hennessy is a 115 Lelbese jet black American bulldog, English Labrador mix. He's basically all muscle, and ever since my boyfriend and I began dating, he's become very protective of me and my own dog. Lahi is a 57 Lelbese poodle mix. The two dogs were her companions, her guardians, but only Hennessy made her feel truly safe in this isolated place. Tessa backed away from the door, her eyes fixed on the handle as it jiggled again. The voice came again, identical, chilling. "I love your dog. Can I meet her?" So I yelled out and asked who was there through the barking. I could hear a man's voice. "I love your dog. Can I meet her?" she shouted back, her voice cracking. "No," and asked him to please go away. But the man didn't leave. The door shuddered as he pushed against it, the wood groaning under his weight. Tessa's mind raced. Why was he here? What did he want? The way he spoke, so flat, so calculated, wasn't human. It was a mask, hiding something far worse. Hennessy, still in the living room, sensed the danger. The hair on the back of Hennessy's neck is standing up, and he is mashing his teeth. His growl was a low, guttural warning. His massive frame tense as he paced. Lahi, smaller but fierce, joined in, her barks sharp and frantic. Tessa's hands shook as she grabbed Hennessy's collar, pulling him toward the door. At that moment, I don't know what possessed me, but I threw Lahi into the bathroom behind me and grabbed Hennessy by the collar, keeping him close to the door with me. The man slammed into the door again, harder this time, and Tessa's fear turned to fury. She wouldn't let him win. She unlocked the door, her heart in her throat, and opened it just enough for Hennessy to lunge halfway out. He's going bonkers at this point. My hand is starting to hurt from holding him back. Hennessy's teeth snapped, his growl a roar that shook the air. The man stumbled back, his hoodie falling to reveal a gaunt face, eyes wide with shock. He didn't even look at me, and instead booked it up the hill as fast as he could and out of sight. Tessa pulled Hennessy back, slamming the door and locking it, her body trembling as she sank to the floor. The house was silent again, but the silence was a lie. Tessa sat against the door, Hennessy's warm bulk pressed against her, Lahi whining from the bathroom. She called the police, her voice unsteady as she recounted the encounter. Eventually, I managed to pull Hennessy back in, and I called the cops to tell them what had happened. The operator took her statement, but without a clear description of the man, there was little they could do. Tessa hung up, her mind replaying the man's voice, his eyes, the way he'd run, not like someone scared, but like someone who'd been caught. That night, Tessa didn't sleep. She kept the lights on, a kitchen knife on the table, Hennessy and Lahi curled up beside her. Honestly, though, I am so thankful for Hennessy. After all of that, I snuggled up with him and Lahi that night and cried because it had all hit me how terrifying that really was. But the fear lingered, a shadow that followed her even in the daylight. The next morning, she walked the property, searching for signs of the man, footprints, a dropped item, anything. She found nothing, but the abandoned houses across the highway seemed to watch her, their broken windows hiding secrets. Tessa began asking neighbors about strangers in the area. The community was tight-knit, but guarded, and most shrugged off her questions. One old man, though, mentioned a drifter who'd been seen near the highway months ago, someone who'd asked about dogs, claiming he'd lost one. The story didn't add up. Why would a drifter target her, follow her, try to break in? Tessa's paranoia grew, her walks with the dogs now limited to daylight, her eyes always scanning the hills. She installed a security camera, its lens pointed at the front door, and checked the footage obsessively. One night, the camera caught something, a flicker of movement at the edge of the frame, a figure too tall, too thin, standing just beyond the porch light. It didn't approach, didn't speak, but it was there, watching. Tessa's blood ran cold. Was it the same man or something else? She didn't know, but the house no longer felt like a sanctuary. Tessa's boyfriend returned a few days later, and she told him everything. He checked the property, reinforced the door, but found no trace of the stranger. I never did get a good look at the guy, and they basically told me that there wasn't anything that I could really do. But they did take my statement. Tessa wanted to believe it was over, but the memory of that voice, "I love your dog, can I meet her?" haunted her. She started noticing small things, a scratch on the doorframe, a faint smell of cigarette smoke near the porch, a shadow that moved too quickly across the hill. She rewarded Hennessy with a massive bone from a pet store an hour away and got Lahi a new toy. I literally went out the next day and bought him the biggest bone that I could find from a pet store nearly an hour away because he definitely had earned it. I also got Lai something too, but material gifts couldn't erase the fear. Tessa began researching the area's history, digging into old records. She found stories of missing hikers, unexplained break-ins, and rumors of a man who'd lived in the abandoned houses, collecting strays, or worse. Her dreams were plagued by the stranger, his face always hidden, his voice echoing in the dark. Sometimes she woke to Hennessy growling at the door, his hackles raised, though nothing was there. Tessa considered moving, but the house was her boyfriend's, and Hennessy was her protector. She couldn't abandon them. Instead, she trained with Hennessy, teaching him commands to guard, to attack if needed. She wasn't just scared anymore, she was ready. The camera footage became her obsession. One clip, time-stamped at 2:17 a.m., showed the figure again, closer this time, its hand brushing the door before retreating into the dark. Tessa sent it to the police, but they dismissed it as inconclusive. She didn't care. She knew he was out there, waiting, watching. And if he came back, she wouldn't hesitate. Hennessy would be ready. And so would she. Oh, Tessa never saw the man again, but she felt it. I'm very thankful, though, that the guy didn't have a firearm. And looking back now, I probably should have called the cops and kept my door closed, to be honest. The hills, once a place of quiet beauty, now held a threat she couldn't name. She stopped walking alone at night, kept Hennessy by her side always, and checked the locks obsessively. Some evenings, when the wind howled, she swore she heard footsteps on the gravel, faint but deliberate, circling the house. The neighborhood carried on, its mix of well-kept and abandoned homes a silent witness to her fear. Tessa shared her story with a few trusted friends, but no one could offer answers. She wondered if the man was still out there, watching other houses, other women waiting for his next chance. The thought was a weight, a scar that changed how she saw the world. Hennessy remained her guardian, his loyalty a light in the dark. Because if he does, this time I'll let my big sweet boy rip him to pieces. Tessa clung to that promise, a vow to herself and her dogs. The stranger had underestimated her once. He wouldn't get a second chance. Story number 12. The house in Alberta, built in the 80s, had always been a quiet sanctuary, until it wasn't. After James's grandfather fell ill, the air inside their home thickened, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. James and his mother noticed unexplainable things: footsteps in the basement, objects misplaced, lights flickering. It started subtly, like a whisper in the dark, but grew louder, more insistent. The disturbances began when his grandfather was hospitalized after a fall down the stairs. Now, with the old man gone, the house felt alive, haunted not by ghosts, but by something deeper, something that refused to let go. James tried to dismiss it as old house noises, but the night his mother left for ice cream changed everything. The basement, where his grandfather's room lay empty, seemed to pulse with a life of its own. James sat in his room, headphones on, the hum of a floor fan drowning out the world. He heard his mother's voice, clear and loud, calling his name to grab the ice cream. He rushed to the door, heart racing, only to find it ajar, the screen door swinging wide. His mother's car was nowhere in sight. The voice had been so real, echoing over the fan's drone, yet the house was empty. James locked the door, his hands trembling, and retreated to his room, the silence now a suffocating weight. It wasn't the first time the house had played tricks. Before his grandfather's death, the disturbances were relentless. The downstairs bathroom sink would run on its own. The washing machine door found open when it had been closed. James's mother, Sarah, found her filing cabinet spilled across the floor. The papers scattered like leaves in a storm. Lights flickered, turning off completely when someone entered a room once. The basement radio blared static for seconds before silencing itself as James passed. The dogs, usually alert, rarely barked, except for a few uneasy growls in the basement. Each incident chipped away at James's skepticism, replacing it with a gnawing dread that something was watching, waiting. The hospital incidents were worse. James's grandfather, frail and fading, saw things no one else could. He whispered to Sarah about a figure in the corner, asking if it was a nurse. She and her sister, Ellen, saw nothing, dismissing it as delirium. But the second time, with only Ellen in the room, he jolted awake, his eyes wide with terror, claiming the devil stood behind her. Ellen felt a cold touch on her shoulder, a breath on her neck, and fled in panic. She called Sarah, hysterical, describing the sensation of being grabbed after that. The hospital grew quiet, but the house never did. The disturbances slowed after his grandfather's passing, but never stopped. The house wasn't just old, it was marked. Sarah had bought it 13 years ago. Its history clean, no deaths reported. But history only tells what's written. The disturbances began in the basement, where James's grandfather had spent his final years. At night, the air grew heavy, the silence broken by faint thumps, like footsteps pacing the concrete. James and Sarah would freeze, listening, convincing themselves it was the house settling. But the house wasn't settling, it was stirring. Objects began to move, a book on a shelf one day, a mug on the floor the next. The basement door, always locked, creaked open in the night. Sarah found her jewelry box upturned, its contents glinting in the moonlight. The dogs, loyal but skittish, avoided the basement stairs. Their ears pricked at sounds James couldn't hear. James tried to stay rational. He was 19, grounded, not one for ghost stories. But the house tested him. One evening, alone, he heard a low hum from the basement, like a voice caught in static. He descended, flashlight in hand, and found the radio on, its dial spinning slowly. He unplugged it, heart pounding, but the hum lingered in his ears. Upstairs, Sarah noticed her own signs, her keys in the fridge, her coat hung backward. They stopped talking about it, as if naming the presence would give it power. But denial didn't stop the shadows from moving, didn't stop the lights from dying when they entered a room. The house was no longer theirs. It belonged to something else. The hospital incidents haunted Sarah more than the house. Her father, James's grandfather, had been a quiet man, his mind sharp until the fall. In his hospital room, he saw things, figures, shadows, things he couldn't name. The first time, with Sarah and Ellen, he seemed confused, pointing to an empty corner. The second time, alone with Ellen, his fear was primal. He screamed about the devil, his voice breaking, warning Ellen it was reaching for her. Ellen's panic was contagious, her story shaking Sarah to her core. The touch on Ellen's shoulder, the breath on her neck, felt too real to dismiss. Sarah wondered if her father had seen something beyond death, something that followed him back to the house or never left. After his death, The house grew quieter, but not silent. The footsteps faded, but objects still shifted. A chair moved an inch overnight. A photo frame tilted on the wall. James felt eyes on him in the basement, though he never saw anything. Sarah, practical but shaken, began planning to move. The night she went for ice cream, James heard her voice, so vivid he apologized for not hearing her return. The open door, the empty driveway, shattered his last defenses. He searched the house with Sarah when she returned, finding nothing. The dogs slept through it all, oblivious. The voice wasn't his mother's, it was the house, mimicking her, luring him to the door. The move couldn't come soon enough. Sarah found a new place, a modern apartment far from Alberta's quiet plains. But the house clung to them. James packed his room, finding an old watch of his grandfather's under his bed. Though he'd never seen it there before, Sarah discovered her father's journal in the basement, its pages blank except for one word scrawled in shaky ink: "Stay." They burned it, unwilling to bring it with them. The dogs, once hesitant, grew restless as moving day neared. Whining at the basement door, James avoided it, refusing to go down alone. The house felt like a living thing, resentful of their departure, its presence heavier with each box packed. The final night was the worst. James and Sarah stayed in a hotel, the house empty but not abandoned. They returned at dawn to load the last boxes, and the air was wrong, thick like stepping into a storm. The basement door was open, though Sarah swore she'd locked it. James heard a faint hum, the same one from the radio, though it was long gone. Sarah grabbed his arm, her face pale, and they left without looking back. The new apartment was bright, clean, but James couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At night, he'd wake, certain he heard footsteps, though the floor was carpeted. Sarah stopped wearing her father's old ring, saying it felt heavy, like it carried the house with it. The house was sold, its new owners unaware of its history. On X, James shared their story, hoping for answers. Others replied with tales of homes that held on to their dead, of voices that weren't there. Some mentioned Alberta's history, old rituals, unmarked graves beneath the plains. None explained the voice, the touch, the devil in the hospital. James and Sarah hoped the move would end it, but the echoes followed. The watch, the ring, the journal's single word, they were reminders that some things don't let go. The house was behind them, but its absence was louder than ever. Story number 13. The call center was a tomb of silence, its darkened halls swallowing every sound. Jacob, the lone night guard, patrolled with only the hum of his own breath for company. But something else was there, hidden in the shadows, waiting to speak. A voice, soft, desperate, impossible, cut through the stillness, begging for help. And in that moment, the empty building became a place where the living were not alone. Jacob, a security guard in his late 20s, worked the overnight shift at a call center in a quiet industrial park. There was no one else in the building. All doors were locked, and all ID scanners were locked as well. The world outside was still, locked down by a global pandemic, leaving the building deserted except for the security team. This happened in 20, when everyone was working from home and the security team were the only people that were even in the building. Jacob relished the solitude, the chance to sit at the desk, play his switch, and watch the cameras. At every odd hour, he would do a patrol around the building, check into all the rooms that he had to swipe at, and return back to the desk. The building was a maze of cubicles and locked offices, its lights dimmed to save power. But the glow from the parking lot was enough to guide his steps. Tonight, though, the air felt different, thicker, as if the building held its breath. Jacob's flashlight beam danced across the walls, catching faint scratches near the stairwell, marks that seemed too precise to be random. As Jacob ascended to the second floor, a phone rang out from the sea of empty desks. He heard one of the phones ringing out in the desks, not unheard of, and because of the sensitivity of it all. They weren't allowed to touch the phones, except for the front desk ones. He shrugged it off, continuing his patrol, but the silence that followed was unnerving. He usually played music to walk around, but this time he'd left his phone to charge at the desk. There was no device on him that could have made a sound. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper, and Jacob's steps slowed near the back stairwell. A faint sound broke the quiet, not a phone, but something softer, like a sigh carried on the wind. Then it came, a woman's voice, clear and trembling, whispering, "Help me!" Jacob froze, his flashlight trembling in his grip. He stayed silent and didn't move for nearly 15 minutes. The voice had come from the stairwell, but the cameras showed nothing, no movement, no figure. He called out, his voice weak, but no one answered. The building seemed to tighten around him, its walls pressing in as if daring him to investigate. Jacob's heart pounded as he retreated to the lobby, abandoning his patrol. He didn't finish his patrol that hour and immediately returned to the desk downstairs where the lights were on. The bright lights offered little comfort. He replayed the camera footage, frame by frame, but the stairwell was empty. He checked the cameras that were in that area and could assure you that there was no one there. The voice echoed in his mind, its plea laced with a sorrow that felt ancient. He thought of the building's history, rumors of workers who'd left abruptly, of accidents never fully explained. Had someone been trapped here? Their cry preserved in the walls? Jacob's boss, when told, only nodded. His boss even asked him when he told him about it, and he just nodded like, "Yeah, that happens sometimes." Jacob never heard the voice again, but the call center was never the same. Each patrol felt like a test, the stairwell a threshold he dared not cross. That night completely proved to him that ghosts really are real, and when one asks for help, you probably shouldn't really risk yourself. The voice lingered, a reminder that some pleas are better left unanswered, locked in the silence of an empty building. Story number P. In Kushima's quiet coastal embrace, where waves murmured secrets to the stars, something sinister stirred. Nora, an English teacher far from home, had found solace in her bright two-bedroom apartment, its warmth a shield against the autumn chill. But that October, as Oben's lanterns dimmed, a shadow crossed her path. She joined friends for a barbecue, trading ghost stories under the night sky. But one tale, told by a trembling colleague, cut too deep. It spoke of a pale specter with long black hair haunting the balconies of a nearby complex. And when Nora drove home, a cold dread whispered that something had followed her. The twin-towered apartment complex, looming over Kushima's edge, was a place of memories and mysteries. Nora had spent countless evenings there with her best friend, laughing in its halls. But with her friend gone, and Ashley a new teacher in her place. The building felt wrong, its corridors too silent, its shadows too deep. Ashley's story at the barbecue had frozen the group. Footsteps from an empty apartment, nightmares of drowning as a ghost watched. A shaman's drawing, shared by their friend Tut, showed the same ghost, crouched on a balcony that mirrored their building. Nora had scoffed, but her heart pounded with a truth she couldn't name. Stepping into Todd's apartment that night, Nora felt the air thicken, heavy as a gathering storm. She spoke of the weight, but Todd dismissed it, needing to rest in his own space. Her drive home was a gauntlet of fear. Her tiny black car, a fragile shell against the dark. She was afraid to look behind her, as if something waited in the back seat. Kushima's lights faded, and her apartment, once a haven, felt like a trap. Its warmth was gone, replaced by a suffocating heaviness, as if the walls held their breath. At 2:30, Nora woke, soaked in sweat, her fists clenched so tightly her arms were numb. The room was wrong, too still, too dense, as if something pressed against her soul. An overwhelming fear kept her eyes shut, her pulse a drum in the silence. She'd never known such terror, never felt so trapped. The next morning, she texted Ashley, who confessed the same nightmare, clenched fists, a presence, and wooden tapping from the corners. Nora had heard it too, blaming the house's settling. But Ashley hadn't mentioned corners. How could their fears align so perfectly? The truth was a jagged wound. Ashley's ghost had claimed Nora too. She searched her apartment, finding handprints on her car's rear window, impossible in her cramped Datsu, too small for anyone to hide. A disconnected phone line rang at 8 p.m., its shrill cry witnessed by her boyfriend. The tapping grew insistent, clawing from the corners like a warning. Nora begged to stay with a neighbor, her once welcoming home now a maze of shadows. The ghost's image, pale, black-haired, lurking beyond the glass, haunted her every thought. Kushima was more than a town. It was a place where the veil between worlds frayed. Nora had dismissed Oben's tales of returning spirits, but doubt gnawed at her now. She and Ashley reached out to Todd. Pleading for his brother's aid, the shaman's symbols arrived, etched with ancient power to cleanse and guard. They burned them as instructed, the smoke rising like a plea, and left one unburned to repel the entity. The air lightened, the tapping stopped, and Nora's apartment breathed again. But she kept one symbol laminated, a ward against the unseen. The ordeal reshaped Nora. She shunned ghost stories, her bravado buried under caution. Kushima's beauty, the sea's song, the mountain's embrace remained, but she avoided the twin towers, their balconies a scar on her memory. "I've wizened up with time and experience," she'd say, her voice firm, but her gaze distant. Ashley left. Todd stayed silent, and the shaman's drawing vanished into a drawer. Some spirits don't just haunt, they hunt. And Nora had felt their hunger. Life moved on, but the echo lingered. Nora taught her classes, smiled with students, but locked her doors twice each night. The handprints never reappeared. Yet she scrubbed her windows raw, erasing a past that clung. Obon came again, lanterns drifting on the sea, but Nora stayed inside, her symbol a silent sentinel. It hasn't bothered us since, she told herself, but she watched the corners, half expecting the tapping to return. Kushima's nights were quiet now, but some silences held weight, and Nora knew better than to trust them. The town's history whispered of others who'd felt the same chill. Old fishermen spoke of lights in the hills, of voices calling from empty boats. Nora listened now, no longer dismissing the tales. She avoided the complex's shortcuts, took longer routes home, and carried a small charm alongside her symbol. Her boyfriend, shaken by the phone's ring, checked the car daily, as if the handprints might return. The twin towers stood unchanged, but their windows seemed to watch, and Nora never looked too long. Story number 5. The room was still. Too still, as if the world had forgotten to breathe. 6-year-old Eli sat cross-legged on the couch, his crayons scattered across the coffee table, the hum of the afternoon sun filtering through the blinds. Then it came, a shadow, vast and angular, spilling across the walls like ink. He looked up, and his heart stopped. Towering before him was a creature, its form sharp and alien, its eyes glinting with an ancient knowing. Eli's breath caught in his throat. The thing was no insect, not as he knew them. Its limbs, long and serrated, folded like a cathedral's arches, filling the room with an oppressive presence. It didn't move, but its gaze pinned him, heavy as stone. The air grew thick, tasting of dust and something metallic, something old. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused. His small hands gripped the couch, knuckles white, as the creature's head tilted, its mandibles twitching faintly. It wasn't just watching him, it was studying him, peeling back his thoughts like pages in a book. Eli felt exposed, as if his fears, his dreams, were no longer his own. The walls seemed to hum, a low vibration that crawled up his spine. The creature's eyes, multifaceted and endless, flickered with colors no child could name. Eli's mind screamed that this was wrong, impossible. Yet the room held its shape, the couch beneath him solid. This was no dream. The thing was real, and it had chosen him. Then it spoke, not with words, but with a pressure in his mind, a cascade of images, vast jungles, stars older than the earth, a purpose he couldn't grasp. Eli's vision blurred, his chest tight. The creature leaned closer, its shadow swallowing the light, and for a moment he saw himself reflected in its eyes, not as a boy, but as something else, something it wanted. Eli's world was small, divined by the familiar creak of the floorboards and the warmth of his mother's voice. He was at home, alone with his mom, while she napped, a quiet afternoon in their modest home. He recalled sitting on the couch in the living room, his coloring book open, when the air shifted. In front of him was a massive praying mantis-like creature, its form so immense it seemed to bend the room itself. It was so massive that it filled the entire room, at least 8 feet tall. The creature's presence was overwhelming, its body a mosaic of green and gold, shimmering like polished armor. Eli went into freeze mode and felt like he shouldn't make any eye contact. His heart pounded, but his limbs were leaden, as if the creature's gaze had woven a spell. He felt like he couldn't move and was paralyzed by fear. The room, once familiar, now felt like a stage for something ancient, something that didn't belong in his world. Eli's young mind struggled to make sense of it. His childhood brain could only process it as being an extremely large bug, but its size defied reason. He felt incredibly confused by just how large it was, yet there was a strange logic to it, as if his 6-year-old self believed such a creature could exist. Hidden in the corners of the world adults never saw. He knew distinctly that this was not a dream. The creature didn't attack or threaten, but its stillness was worse. Its eyes, like twin galaxies, seemed to hold secrets older than time. Eli's thoughts raced. Had it always been here, watching? Was it waiting for him to move, to speak? The air grew heavier, the sunlight dimming as if the creature drew the light into itself. He saw flashes of places he'd never been, stone temples overgrown with vines, skies streaked with fire. A chorus of voices chanting in a tongue he didn't know. Minutes stretched into eternity. Eli sat there trying to be as still as possible for a couple of minutes. Then a spark of courage or desperation ignited. He mustered up the courage to run upstairs and ask his mom for help. His legs, shaky but determined, carried him up the stairs, the creature's presence lingering like a weight on his back. He woke his mom up and told her that there was a massive praying mantis downstairs. His mother, groggy but concerned, followed him down. She thought that it must have been a normal-sized bug, but the living room was empty. The air light again, the crayons still scattered on the table. It was gone. Eli stood frozen, his words caught in his throat. He was too stunned by its disappearance and almost embarrassed to tell her what he had actually seen. The normalcy of the room mocked him, making him question his own eyes. His mother patted his head, her smile gentle but dismissive, and returned to her nap. Eli lingered in the living room, his heart still racing. The walls felt different now, thinner, as if they could no longer keep the world out. He glanced at the window, half expecting to see those eyes staring back. The creature was gone, but its message lingered, a riddle he was too young to solve. Years passed, but the memory never faded. Eli grew up, the encounter buried beneath the noise of life, yet it resurfaced in quiet moments. He felt very confused and tried to understand how his imagination could have possibly generated something that felt so real. Then, in his teens, he met Lila, a girl who spoke of strange things, visions, spirits, worlds beyond. Later in life, he had a friend. Her name was Eve, though in this telling, Lila was her name, and her story shook him. Lila had been guiding friends through a night of exploration, their minds opened by substances that blurred reality. When chaos erupted, she felt lost, until a vision came, a towering mantis, its voice a calm current in her mind, guiding her to safety. Eve said that she was suddenly greeted by a praying mantis, who were somehow giving her advice. The creature's wisdom saved her friends, and Lila spoke of it with reverence, as if it were a guardian from another realm. Eli's blood ran cold. Was it the same creature? Had it chosen others, weaving itself into their lives as it had his? He began to research, diving into tales of mantis-like beings, messengers, watchers, entities that appeared to those on the edge of understanding. Some called them gods, others demons, but all agreed they were not of this world. They didn't harm, but they demanded attention, leaving those they visited forever changed. The more Eli learned, the more he questioned. Had the creature come to warn him, to teach him, or to claim him? The living room, now long gone, felt like a threshold he'd crossed without knowing. Late at night, he'd lie awake, the hum of that day echoing in his mind. Sometimes, in the dark, he felt it again, that weight, that gaze, watching from just beyond the veil. Eli never saw the creature again, but its shadow lingered. He avoided praying mantises, their small forms too close to that towering memory. The world felt larger now, layered with possibilities he couldn't dismiss. He still didn't know what to think of it. But he knew one thing: the Titan mantis had seen him, known him, and left a mark that time could not erase. Story number 16. The clock on the dashboard glowed 9:40 p.m. as Caleb sat in the passenger seat, the hum of the car a faint comfort against the dark Virginia night. His friend Ethan gripped the wheel, navigating the quiet streets after a movie. The theater was across town, a solid 15-minute drive from Caleb's apartment. But as they rounded a corner, the world seemed to shift. The streetlights flickered, and a strange warmth bloomed in Caleb's chest, sharp and searing, like a coal pressed against his ribs. Ethan's brow furrowed. This is downtown," he muttered, his voice tight. They were parked outside Caleb's building, the neon sign of a nearby diner buzzing in the silence. Caleb glanced at his watch. 9:50 p.m. 5 minutes. It had taken 5 minutes to cross the city. The air felt heavy, charged, as if the universe itself had bent around them. Ethan's hands trembled on the wheel, his eyes wide. "We didn't turn. How are we here?" Caleb didn't answer. He couldn't. This wasn't the first time. Twice before, the world had unraveled like this, spitting him out somewhere he shouldn't be. Each time, that burning sensation had clawed at his chest, followed by a bone-deep unease that made his legs feel like lead. He looked at Ethan, who was staring at the dashboard as if it might explain what had just happened. The street was too quiet, the shadows too deep. Inside Caleb's apartment, they sat in stunned silence, the TV flickering, but ignored. Ethan finally spoke, his voice low. "You've felt this before, haven't you?" Caleb nodded, his throat tight. He told Ethan about the other times, moments when time and space seemed to collapse, leaving him stranded in the wrong place, the wrong moment. The memories were vivid, each one etched with that same searing pain and disorientation. Caleb's fear was palpable, a living thing in the room. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew it wasn't random. Something was pulling him, bending the rules of reality. And now Ethan had felt it too. The question hung unspoken between them. What was doing this? And why? As the night stretched on, the apartment's walls seemed to close in, the world outside no longer trustworthy. Caleb had experienced this 3 times, and each was more unnerving than the last. The first incident had been deceptively simple. He'd been walking to a gas station after a long shift. The evening air cooled against his skin. The plan was to grab a soda and some chips, a small reward for surviving the day. The gas station was a 10-minute walk from his office, a straight shot down a familiar street. But as he crossed an intersection, the world blurred. One moment, he was passing the old laundromat with its flickering neon sign. The next, he was standing on a different street, a mile away, near a pawn shop he rarely visited. His watch read 6:32 p.m., the same time he'd noted just before leaving the office. No time had passed at all, yet he was somewhere else. The burning in his chest hit then, sharp and relentless, followed by a wave of nausea that made his steps clumsy. He'd checked his surroundings, half expecting to see someone or something watching, but the street was empty. Caleb had brushed it off as exhaustion, a trick of the mind. But the second time was harder to ignore. He'd been in a car with his friend Jay, heading to a Walmart 30 minutes from Jay's house. It was a sunny morning, the kind that made Virginia's rolling hills look like a postcard. They took a scenic road, one that wound through fields and past old barns, a straight path that should have led toward North Carolina. But 10 minutes into the drive, Jay frowned, glancing at the Jeepy. "Caleb, this isn't right," Jay said, his voice unsteady. They were on a road that looked almost identical. Same golden fields, same weathered fences, but the Walmart loomed ahead, its parking lot bustling. They'd arrived in 10 minutes, not 30. The burning hit them both, a shared agony that left them gripping the dashboard. Jay's hands shook as he parked, his usual confidence gone. "We didn't take any shortcuts," he muttered. "We shouldn't be here." That time, Caleb had felt the weight of it, the impossibility of what had happened. He and Jay had sat in the Walmart parking lot, trying to piece together the drive, but the memory was slippery, like a dream fading upon waking. The unease lingered, making every step feel wrong, as if their bodies were rejecting the reality they'd been thrust into. They didn't talk about it again, but Caleb saw the fear in Jay's eyes, a mirror of his own. The third time, with Ethan, had been the breaking point. They'd been stone cold sober, not distracted by conversation or music. The drive from the theater should have been routine, a familiar route through the city's quieter edges. But the transition was seamless, almost invisible, until they ended up downtown, the city's skyline appearing as if summoned. The burning in Caleb's chest was worse this time, a fire that spread to his limbs, leaving him clumsy as he climbed the stairs to his apartment. Inside, Caleb and Ethan tried to rationalize it. Maybe they'd zoned out, missed a turn, but the math didn't add up. 5 minutes to cross a 15-minute distance with no shortcuts or wrong turns. Ethan's voice cracked as he asked, "What's doing this to you? To us?" Caleb had no answer, only a growing dread that this wasn't random. Something was targeting him, bending the fabric of the world to pull him somewhere, or to keep him from somewhere else. The next morning, Caleb stood at his window, staring at the street below. Every car, every pedestrian felt like a potential clue or a threat. The burning sensation had faded, but the unease hadn't. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, not by a person, but by something vast and unseen. Oh, the city, once familiar, now felt like a maze with hidden exits. He started researching, scouring forums and old books for anything about teleportation or time slips. Most of what he found was speculation, quantum anomalies, ley lines, even alien tech. But one obscure post caught his eye, buried in a thread about Virginia's history. It described a series of incidents in the 1970s. People vanishing from one spot and reappearing miles away, all reporting a burning sensation and disorientation. The post ended abruptly, the author claiming they'd been warned to stop digging. Caleb's blood ran cold. He didn't know if it was true, but the parallels were too close. He showed the post to Ethan, who read it in silence, his face pale. "We need to figure this out," Ethan said, his voice firm, despite the fear in his eyes. They agreed to keep track of every detail, times, locations, sensations, hoping to find a pattern. But deep down, Caleb wondered if understanding it would make it stop or make it worse. That night, Caleb lay awake, the darkness pressing against his window. The city was quiet, but he could almost hear it, a faint hum like the world itself was vibrating. He closed his eyes, trying to block it out, but the burning sensation flickered in his chest, a warning of what might come. Whatever this was, it wasn't done with him, and he wasn't sure he could outrun it. Story number 7. The night was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. 10-year-old Jamie sat cross-legged on his grandma's worn couch, the glow of an old TV flickering across the living room. The Mississippi woods pressed close to the house, their shadows clawing at the edges of the big window. He'd been watching cartoons, but now, in the dead of night, the house felt different, wrong. Jamie stood, his bare feet cold against the floor, and headed for the kitchen to grab a soda. Something made him pause, a chill that wasn't there before. He glanced at the huge window and froze. A man in a black suit stood out, his face a blank void. The figure didn't move, but Jamie's heart slammed against his ribs. Where a face should have been, there was nothing, just smooth, featureless skin like a mannequin left in the dark. The woods were empty at night, save for the occasional hunter, but this was no hunter. Jamie's breath hitched as he backed away, his eyes locked on the figure. The man stood motionless, yet somehow seemed to stare right through him, pinning him in place. The house, with its creaking floors and sagging walls, felt like a trap closing around him. He wanted to scream, but the silence choked his voice. Each step toward the kitchen felt like wading through molasses. The dining room's bay window loomed ahead, its glass reflecting the dim light of a single bulb. Jamie peeked out, and there the man was, closer now, just beyond the deck, his faceless head tilted as if listening. The boy's hands shook as he grabbed a soda from the fridge, the can icy against his palm. His chest pounded with fear, the man's presence a weight he couldn't shake. This wasn't a dream. Jamie knew it in his bones. The figure hadn't moved again, but its stillness was more terrifying than any motion. The living room felt safer, its locked doors a thin shield against the night. Jamie sank onto the couch, clutching his soda. The TV's chatter, a weak defense against the dread. He looked at the window again, and the man was closer still, his hands limp by his sides, his blank face pressed near the glass. Jamie's pulse roared in his ears. He stood, desperate to act normal, and shuffled to the kitchen to toss the empty can. The bay window showed the man hadn't advanced this time, but the air was thick with his presence, like a storm about to break. Jamie turned off the TV, the sudden silence deafening. He felt eyes on him, though he didn't dare look back. His grandma and her husband slept soundly, the hum of a sleep apnea machine droning from their room. The hallway to the bedroom stretched endlessly before him, each shadow a threat. Jamie hurried to the room he shared with his sister, her soft snores a small comfort. He collapsed onto a pallet on the floor, pulling a blanket over his head. Sleep came slowly, but the faceless man's gaze lingered in his mind, a scar that wouldn't fade. Morning brought no answers. Jamie told his sister, Lily, about the man, but she laughed it off, blaming his imagination and late-night TV. Grandma, though, listened quietly, her eyes narrowing. She'd heard stories from neighbors, whispers of a figure seen in the woods, always at night, always faceless. Some said it was a ghost, others a warning. Grandma never spoke of it again, but she started locking the doors earlier and kept the curtains drawn after dusk. Jamie noticed the change. Though he didn't push for answers, the woods felt different now, their shadows heavier, their silence alive. Years later, as a teenager, Jamie dug into local lore. The woods near Grandma's house had a history. Disappearances in the 1950s, a family gone without a trace. Old-timers spoke of a man in a suit, seen by children, always at the edge of the trees. No one knew who or what he was. Jamie never saw the figure again, but he avoided the woods, even in daylight. The memory of that night stayed sharp, a reminder that some things don't need faces to terrify. He wondered if the man still waited, watching from the dark, patient for the next child to look out the wrong window. Story number 18, The Blackwood River Whispered Secrets no city boy could understand. Its waters dark and restless, under a sky bleeding red with dusk. In the late summer of 1998, 10-year-old Tommy Harper stood alone on its banks, his fishing rod trembling in hands too young to know fear's true weight. The southwest Australian forest loomed behind him, its eucalyptus trees clawing at the heavens, their shadows alive with something older than the land itself. Tommy thought he was king of this wild place, but the river knew better. It always did. The air grew heavy, not with heat, but with a presence that pressed against Tommy's chest. Slowing his breath, his bucket of trout glinted in the fading light, a prize he'd fought the river for. But the forest wasn't empty. Eyes watched from the undergrowth, unseen, unblinking, waiting for the moment the boy crossed a line he didn't know existed. The river's song turned sour, a warning woven into its ripples, but Tommy, bold and reckless, ignored it. A stone skipped across the water, landing with a sharp clink against the bucket. Tommy froze, his eyes darting to the trees. Another stone followed, then another, each one heavier, each one closer. The forest held its breath, the birds jumped. The wind gone, he was no longer alone. And whatever shared the riverbank with him wasn't human. It wasn't animal either. It was something the land had birthed long before men dared to call it theirs. Tommy's heart pounded, a drumbeat echoing in the stillness. He clutched his pocket knife, its blade dull but comforting. The stones stopped, but the silence was worse, thick, suffocating, like the moment before a storm breaks. Across the river, shapes emerged from the dusk, small but wrong, their outlines defying the logic of the world he knew. They didn't move, didn't speak, but their gaze pinned him, stripping away his courage, his pride, his very sense of self. He should have run then, should have dropped everything and fled to the safety of his aunt's farm. But curiosity, that cruel trickster, held him fast. The shapes watched, and Tommy, fool that he was, stared back. The Blackwood River flowed on, indifferent to the boy and the things that claimed its banks. It had seen this dance before, and it would see it again. The only question was whether Tommy would live to tell of it. In the southwest region, they are known as the Warajee, or hairy bushmen. Standing a few feet tall, they possessed insane strength and speed. The story said they were guardians or thieves or both, creatures that walked with the first men, their alliances fragile, their wrath swift. Tommy, a city kid with no roots in the land's ancient ways, knew none of this. His world was dirt bikes, open fields, and the thrill of a fish on the line. But the Warajee didn't care for innocence. They only cared for respect. Every school holidays, I used to leave the city and visit my aunt in the picturesque southwest countryside. I needed no encouragement in going because I loved the outdoors and had free rein to run a mark on the dirt bike and go fishing alongside the magnificent Blackwood River whenever I felt like it. The farm was a paradise, its boundaries vast, its rules few. Tommy roamed miles of scrub and forest, his only companion a knife too small for the dangers he'd soon face. His aunt, a kind but distracted woman, trusted the land to keep him safe. She was wrong. The Blackwood River was no ordinary place. Its waters paved through the forest like a scar, deep and old, carrying stories no book could hold. Tommy loved its banks, where the soil was soft and the fish were plenty. He'd spend hours there, casting lines, dreaming of the city he'd left behind. On the last evening, before I was due to go back home to the city, I was down there fishing alone as the sun was setting. I knew that I'd get into trouble being out that late, but having already snared a few trout, I figured that I'd be quickly forgiven. The trout were his trophy, proof of his skill, but the river demanded more than he knew. The first stone was a curiosity, a soft tap against the metal bucket. Tommy glanced up, expecting a bird or a falling nut. The second was louder, deliberate, a message he didn't yet understand. I was on my last few pieces of bait anyway, when I recall hearing a tiny sort of pinging noise on the side of the bucket. At first, I thought nothing of it, because large gum nuts often fell from the trees. But then it happened again, much louder and more forceful this time. He checked the bucket, his fingers brushing cold metal. No nuts, only pebbles, small and smooth, as if chosen with care. Fear crept in, slow at first, then all at once. The stones grew larger, their aim sharper. One grazed his cheek, drawing blood that felt hot against the evening chill. Another struck his temple, and stars burst behind his eyes. The rocks, they got bigger, and they started flying in from different directions, cutting my cheek and hitting me in the head. At this stage, I started crying. I was only 10 after all, and dropped the fishing rod. Tommy's bravado crumbled. He was a boy, not a hero, and the forest knew it. He reached for the bucket, desperate to flee, but a final stone caught him in the side of the head, knocking him to the dirt. Pain blurred his vision, but fear sharpened his senses. As I bent to pick it up, though, I was hit by another rock in the side of the head and fell over. I pulled myself up and I stared over to the other side of the river. the main source of the rocks. Across the blackwood, in the dim light of dusk, 3 figures stood, their forms small but heavy with menace. What I saw paralyzed my whole body with fear. It was nearly dark at this stage, but I saw the outline of 3 short-looking bodies covered in hair. I would have put them at maybe a meter tall, 3 or 4 feet at most, the size of small children, but with the bodies of men. Their arms were too long, their legs thick with muscle. Their faces looked like they were sort of part ape, part human, but it was their eyes, though. Even though it was getting dark, their eyes had this piercing yellow glow, but were completely black in the middle. The eyes weren't just watching, they were judging, ancient and unforgiving. Tommy's breath caught, his body refusing to move. They wore no clothes, but were covered in extremely thick, sort of clumpy hair all over their bodies, except from the knees down, and had arms that hung almost like cavemen. The Waraji stood like statues, their silence louder than the stones they'd thrown. But here's the strangest thing. They stared at me almost without moving, like literal statues, with a curious expression fixed on their faces and making absolutely no noise whatsoever. Their stillness was unnatural, a predator's patience, and Tommy felt like prey. He ran, his legs pumping through pain and terror, the bucket and rod forgotten, the forest blurred around him, branches clawing at his skin. I managed to pull myself up and ran faster than all heck. My aunt was standing on the balcony and watched me tear through the long grass as quick as I could, with the blood and the cuts on my face. His aunt, silhouetted against the farmhouse's warm light, rushed to him, her face pale. Tommy stammered his story, stones, figures, eyes that burned. She held him, but her eyes darted to the forest, as if she sensed the truth he couldn't name. I told her everything, and she eventually called the police. One officer came by to get a statement, and he said that he'd visit some of the other farms around town. But he was certain that there weren't any other families in the area. The officer's words were kind but dismissive, his notepad filled with a child's wild tale. My aunt just assumed that I couldn't see the figures properly due to the lack of light, and maybe even was suffering concussion from the rocks that hit my head. She wanted to believe it was kids, vandals, anything but what Tommy described. But the boy knew better. Morning brought no comfort. Tommy and his aunt returned to the river, the forest now bright but no less menacing. The next morning, I went with my aunt to collect the fishing rod and the bucket. And my aunt was shocked to see the fishing rod and the bucket were still there. The bucket sat untouched, its contents a nightmare. And we checked the bucket, and what we saw made our skin crawl. 3 perfect trout skeletons were now floating in the bucket. Not one morsel left. No animal could do that, not in Australia, not without spilling the water or scattering the bones. The police found nothing. Their search, as empty as the bucket's fleshless fish. The police officer, they found nothing of note, and as nothing was stolen, there was no need for further inquiry. The town buzzed with the story, farmers swapping tales of odd lights and stranger sounds in the deep woods. The town had experienced odd things throughout the years, such as the sighting of tiger-like animals in the deep forest and other strange noises and happenings reported by lumberjacks in the deep forest, too. But Tommy's encounter was different, sharper, a wound that wouldn't close. Years passed, and Tommy grew into a man, his childhood adventure buried under the weight of city life. But the river never left him. In his 20s, working as a social worker, he found himself among Aboriginal communities, their stories a mirror to his own. But it wasn't until I got into my 20s and became a social worker that I started working with Aboriginal communities in town during celebratory events. I came to learn of the different Dreamtime creation stories, and eventually I had the confidence to tell an elder about what I went through when I was young. An elder listened, his face grave, and named the Waraji without hesitation. He immediately recognized it as the Waraji straight away and said that I was lucky to leave that forest alive. He seemed to think that they must have believed that I was an Aboriginal boy. The elder spoke of rules Tommy had broken: fishing without offering, trespassing on sacred ground. And I do have a mixed racial background, and the protocol would have been for me to leave a couple of fish outside the bucket, skewered on the sticks for them to come and collect, after as payment for fishing in their river. Tommy's ignorance had been his crime, his survival a fluke. The Waraji were not just stories, they were the land's enforcers, its memory, its vengeance. The elder's words chilled Tommy, but they also gave shape to the fear he'd carried. The older believed that they could have taken me, though, for disobeying their sacred customs. He saw those yellow eyes in his dreams, felt their gaze in quiet moments. The Blackwood River had let him go, but it hadn't forgotten him. Tommy never returned to the farm. His aunt sold it years later, the land passing to strangers who'd never know its secrets. But Tommy carried the river with him, its waters flowing through his thought. He avoided forests, rivers, any place where the world felt too alive. The Waraji had marked him, not with scars, but with a truth. The land was not his, and it never would be. He wondered if they still watched, if they waited for another boy, another mistake. Now, at 36, Tommy sat in a small apartment, the city's hum a poor shield against memory. He wrote his story, not for fame, but for release, hoping words could cage the fear. The Waraji were real as the river, as real as the bones in that bucket. He didn't need proof. Those eyes were proof enough. And every night, when the world grew quiet, he listened for the sound of tones, knowing they might find him again. Story number 9. Deep in the Chippewa National Forest, where the trees stood like silent sentinels, and the darkness swallowed all but the faintest glint of starlight, a boy named Ethan and his father waited in their hunting lodge, trapped by a mystery that defied reason. The annual deer hunt had brought their family together, scattered across 60 acres of untamed wilderness. But tonight, something felt wrong, terribly wrong. The lodge's door, secured by a heavy latch that took real strength to budge, refused to open, as if sealed by an unseen hand. Ethan's heart raced as he pushed against the door, the wood groaning but holding fast, while the forest outside seemed to watch, its silence thick with menace. No one could have locked them in, not from the outside, not without them knowing, yet here they were, caged in their own sanctuary, with no explanation but the chill of fear. The night had started like any other, with Ethan and his father perched in their lodge, one of the closest to the family's camp. The Chippewa Forest was a place of tradition where generations of their kin had hunted, laughed, and told stories under the stars. But as darkness fell, the usual comfort of routine gave way to unease. They were waiting for their family to come back down the trail, their headlamps yet to pierce the black, Ethan, restless, suggested they step out to meet the others. He reached for the door, expecting it to swing open with a familiar creak. Instead, it held firm, the latch unyielding. His dad said, "What the heck? Why or how would you lock us in like this?" Ethan's stomach dropped as he pushed harder, his hands slick with sweat. "Dad, there's no way to lock it from in here," he stammered. The lodge had a locking latch on the outside and inside, a sturdy mechanism that required deliberate force to slide through its slot and snap into place. It was impossible to lock yourself in the deer stand. Ethan had checked the latch when they entered, securing it from the inside, as always. The outside latch was out of reach, far beyond the small window's grasp. Yet, here they were, trapped. The door mocking their efforts with its stubborn resistance. The forest outside seemed to tighten its grip, the silence pressing against the lodge's walls like a living thing. Ethan's mind raced, conjuring images of something or someone out there, tampering with the latch. They were completely dumbfounded and kind of freaked out. The Chippewa was vast, its trails winding through shadows where anything could hide. Had someone followed them? A prank gone too far? Or was it something else? Something the old hunters whispered about in low tones, things that didn't belong to the world of men. Ethan tried to open the door again, but it was stuck shut. The air inside the lodge grew heavy, each breath a reminder of their confinement. Ethan's father, usually unflappable, paced the small space, his boots thudding against the wooden floor. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, checking the latch himself. It took real strength to push that latch up and through the hole and latch back down. No wind, no accident could have done this. Ethan pressed his ear to the door, straining for any sound, a footstep, a rustle, anything. Nothing but the oppressive quiet, broken only by the faint hum of his own pulse. They waited for their family to come to the trail, hoping for rescue. But the minutes stretched into eternity. Finally, a flicker of light broke the darkness outside, headlamps bobbing along the trail. Ethan's brother, Caleb, approached the lodge, his silhouette a welcome sight. He walked up to the stand and opened the latch for them, his face creasing with confusion as the door swung free. "How'd you manage that?" Caleb asked, peering at the latch. He was also confused how that could have possibly happened. Ethan and his father stepped out, the cold air a relief after the stifling lodge. They explained, their voices overlapping, but no one had an answer. The latch was pristine, no signs of tampering, yet it had held them captive with impossible strength. The family trudged back to camp, the incident hanging over them like a storm cloud. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had played a trick, its depths hiding secrets older than the trees. He still didn't know how this happened, but it freaked him out to think someone was out there trying to lock them in. The Chippewa had always been a place of solace, but now it felt like a maze of unseen eyes. He was a little nervous to go hunting this year. The thought of those early morning treks and twilight returns filling him with dread. What if it happened again? What if next time no one came to open the door? Ethan's unease grew in the months that followed, the memory of that night etched into his bones. He asked around, digging into the forest history, and found whispers of strange occurrences. Hunters hearing footsteps that stopped too close, shadows moving where no one should be. Some spoke of the keeper, a figure said to guard the Chippewa, testing those who ventured too deep. He hoped he wouldn't experience anything like that again because it definitely had him unnerved. The lodge, once a haven, now loomed in his mind as a trap. Its latch, a puzzle with no solution, waiting for him in the dark. Story number 20. The night was too still, the kind of quiet that made your skin crawl. Clara stood on the back porch, the glow of her cigarette a faint beacon in the dark. The old house loomed behind her, its windows like eyes that never blinked. She'd lived with her grandparents most of her life, until last year. But something about this place, something beyond the creaking boards and peeling paint, had always felt wrong. Tonight, it was worse. The air seemed to watch her, waiting. Clara had never been in tune with the supernatural, not like her brother. He'd always seen things, spoken of shadows that moved when they shouldn't. Clara, though, preferred the rational, the explainable. But at 18, she'd seen something she couldn't ignore. It was outside her grandma's van, a figure that wore her ex-boyfriend's shape, but not his face. It was faceless, wearing clothes he'd never worn, facing the wrong way. She'd frozen, her heart hammering, and then it was gone. The memory had faded, buried under the weight of daily life. But now, standing alone in the yard, that old unease clawed its way back. She'd started smoking outside at night to help her sleep. The ritual was simple. Light up, breathe out, let the world fade. But the world wasn't fading tonight. The darkness felt alive, heavy with intent. Clara flicked ash into the grass, her eyes scanning the shadows. Something moved near the van, a flicker, too quick to be sure. She told herself it was nothing, but her pulse said otherwise. The van sat under the oak tree, its rusted frame a familiar sight. Yet, as Clara stared, a shape emerged from behind it. It looked like her mom once, then her brother, bending over to peer at her just as he would. The figure was tall, too tall, its face a blank void where features should have been. It felt like it was mocking her, its presence a twisted mirror of her own. Clara's cigarette fell, smoldering in the dirt. The thing didn't move, didn't speak, but its kiss burned into her. Clara's breath hitched, her mind screaming that this wasn't real. She'd thought she was hallucinating at first, seeing it only outside the house. But this was no trick of the mind. The face morphed, twisting into something almost familiar, then wrong. It wore her face now, dressed in a way she never would, polished, perfect, a cruel parody. She could feel it looking at her, its stare a weight that pinned her in place. Clara stumbled back, her boots crunching on gravel. The house felt miles away, its porch light a distant star. She'd seen this thing before, not just at 18, but in the years since. It had appeared in glimpses, her mother's silhouette by the fence, her brother's frame lurking near the shed. Each time, it was the same. No face, wrong clothes, a silent mockery. It never came close, never moved. But its presence was enough. Clara had stopped going out alone, but tonight, her brother was sick, and she'd had no choice. Inside, the house was no safer. Her brother, Ethan, had his own stories. He'd seen it longer, said it chased him as a black shadow figure. He'd found it in the laundry room, wearing their mother's shape, staring from the doorway. He'd heard their grandma's voice calling his name when she wasn't home. Ethan called it a mimic, a thing that stole faces to unsettle, to feed on fear. Clara hadn't wanted to believe him, but the evidence was mounting. Carved into every sleepless night, she lit another cigarette, her hands trembling. The yard was empty now, but the feeling lingered, like eyes boring into her back. Clara remembered the old stories her grandma told, tales of things that lived in the land before the house was built. They weren't ghosts, not exactly. They were older, hungrier, drawn to the living like moths to a flame. The thing hadn't wanted to hurt her, she thought, but it wasn't benign. It wanted something, attention, reaction, maybe fear. Clara forced herself to move, crossing the yard to the van. She needed to see, to prove it was nothing. The air grew thicker, the shadows deeper. Behind the van, she found marks in the dirt, long, uneven scratches, too deliberate to be random. Her stomach twisted. Trust her. The thing had been here, watching, always watching. She backed away, her eyes darting to the house. The porch light flickered, then steadied. But it wasn't enough to shake the dread. Inside, she found Ethan in the kitchen, his face pale. He didn't need to ask what she'd seen. Her expression told him everything. "It's still here," he said, his voice low. He showed her a notebook, pages filled with dates and sightings. The mimic had been bolder lately, appearing inside, mimicking their grandma's voice. Clara didn't want to believe it was a mimic, but everything pointed that way. She sank into a chair, the weight of it all crushing her resolve. They stayed up, talking in hushed tones. Ethan spoke of a neighbor, an old man who'd lived here decades ago. He'd warned about the land, said it held on to things that didn't die. Clara hadn't listened then, but now she wished she had. The house felt different now, its walls too thin, its shadows too deep. She glanced at the window, half expecting the mimic's blank face to peer back. Nothing, just the night, endless and waiting. Clara moved out soon after, to her boyfriend's place. The mimic didn't follow, but the fear did. She hadn't seen it since, but the memory was enough. Ethan stayed, determined to face it, to find answers. He sent her texts sometimes, new sightings, new voices. Clara didn't reply. She couldn't. The thing was tied to the house, to the land, to them, and deep down, she knew it was still out there, wearing their faces, watching from the dark. Story number 21. The old terrace house on Willow Street didn't look like much from the outside. Just another 8th century relic tucked among modern shops. Its stone facade weathered but proud. For Thomas, a seasoned property agent, it was just another job. Snap some photos, measure the rooms, and move on. But as he turned the key in the lock, the air shifted, heavy with a malice that pressed against his chest. This wasn't a house. It was a predator, waiting for him to step inside. The door creaked open, revealing a dim hallway lined with ancient beams. Thomas forced a chuckle, blaming his unease on the late hour and the chill of the English autumn. He flicked on the lights, but they buzzed faintly, casting long, twitching shadows. Something in the house seemed to watch, not with eyes, but with the walls themselves, as if they resented his presence. He shook it off, pulling out his phone to play music, anything to drown out the oppressive silence. Downstairs, the living room and kitchen felt cold, but manageable. Thomas moved quickly, snapping photos, measuring corners, humming to keep his nerves steady. Yet every step echoed too loudly, like the house was amplifying his intrusion, mocking his attempt to claim it. He tried to focus on the job, but the air grew thicker, the lights dimmer. as if the house was tightening its grip. What kind of place was this? And why did it feel like it hated him? He reached the staircase, and the world seemed to tilt. Each step upward felt like wading through molasses. His legs heavy with a dread he couldn't explain. The house's hostility was no longer subtle. It was a force, pushing back, warning him to turn around. Thomas gripped the banister, his playlist stuttering on his phone, the cheerful pop song breaking into distorted fragments. He was alone, but he wasn't. The house was alive, and it wanted him gone. The upstairs landing loomed, and his eyes locked onto a door at the far end, ajar, leading to the attic stairs. Darkness spilled from it, thick and unnatural, swallowing the faint light from the hall. Thomas's heart pounded, his body screaming to flee, but his feet wouldn't move. I knew something wasn't right as soon as I set foot in the property. The house's malice was a physical thing now, wrapping around him, daring him to take another step. Thomas forced himself to move, camera in hand, determined to finish the job. Everyone gets times when the vibes were off. And I'm not someone who claims to be in touch with their spiritual side or anything, but the atmosphere when I went in was just downright hostile. He photographed the bedrooms, each one colder than the last, the air heavy with a resentment he couldn't shake. The bathroom's mirror reflected his pale face, but for a moment he swore the reflection lagged, moving a fraction slower than he did. He tried to ignore it, sticking to his routine. I was already a little spooked, but I had a job to do. So I opened up a playlist on Spotify, hit shuffle, and started turning the lights on. But the house fought back. Lights flickered off as soon as he turned them on, plunging rooms into shadow. I have a bit of a system when photographing a property too. Lights on, photograph, measure the room, lights off. Downstairs, it had worked. Up here, the house made its own rules. The attic door called to him again, its darkness a void that seemed to breathe. As soon as my foot hit the first step, this overwhelming urge that something was wrong surged through my body. He climbed the stairs to the second floor, each step heavier, his breath shallow. I started singing louder, trying to distract myself, and another few steps up, I was hit with another wave of fear. The house wasn't just old, it was angry. Its history etched into every beam, every creaking floorboard. And it saw Thomas as an intruder. His phone's music stopped entirely, the screen frozen despite a full battery. I tell myself that the upstairs must have been in some sort of dead zone, because it was at this stage that my phone decided that the songs that had had no problem playing 10 minutes ago suddenly needed buffering. Thomas stood at the top of the stairs, the attic door now fully in view. I fought against my body to get up to the top of the stairs. And when I did, my eyes were drawn to the door to the attic stairs, which lay ajar. The darkness beyond wasn't just absence of light. It was something alive, pulsing, waiting. He couldn't move. The room beyond the doorway was cloaked in darkness due to the lack of lights being turned on. And the fear that was pushing through my body just took over me. His camera slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor, but he couldn't look away from the doorway. I stood there paralyzed. I couldn't even blink or take my eyes off of the void. The house's hatred was a weight, crushing him, whispering in a language he couldn't hear but felt in his bones. You don't belong here. Thomas didn't remember running. One moment, he was frozen. The next, he was outside, gasping in the cold night air, his camera left behind. The house stood slant, its windows like eyes watching him flee. He never returned, not even to retrieve his equipment. Later, he learned the tenant had fled within months, breaking the lease without explanation. The landlord refused to discuss the property, his face pale when Thomas pressed for answers. Years later, Thomas still avoids Willow Street. The agency stopped listing the house, and it remains empty, its doors locked, its malice contained for now. But Thomas can't forget the feeling of that darkness, the way the house seemed to know him, to judge him. He wonders what it was guarding, what secret lay hidden in that attic, and whether it's still waiting for someone else to step inside.